Peace and love, peace and love. This is Brother Garfield. Welcome to a series I'm trying to start called History and the Bible on Thursday evenings. And my first guest and the person who's going to kick this off for me is Dr. Richard Carrier. People know him from the book about On the Historicity of Jesus. And so first and foremost, let me just welcome my guest to the stage. How are you doing today, Dr. Carrier? Good to see you again.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, nice to be here.
Yeah, you're like a regular here, man. You're like a part of the whole Brother Garfield podcast family now. You're official because this is like your 7th or 8th time we're doing something together.
Yeah.
And let me ask you this: are you working, before we get into any topic at all? Are you working on any new projects at all, as far as books, articles? What are you working currently on?
Yeah. So articles and a new book. So not a new book per se. So I'm in contract with my publisher Sheffield Phoenix to do either a second edition of On the Historicity of Jesus or a second volume with different content, and so on the same subject. So we're all editors and me all leaning towards a second volume idea pretty strongly. So because we have great ideas about it. So one way or another, what I'm doing is I'm doing research and work in preparation for that, and so I should have that done by the end of this year, and it should be out next year, which will be the 10th anniversary of the book. So in the 10th anniversary, my new book should come out. And so, like I said, it's probably going to be a new volume, but it'll be on the same subject, and it will be peer reviewed, and it will be by the same publisher and the whole thing. In preparation for that, I'm also preparing articles that I'm going to submit to peer review that'll appear in journals and things like that. So it's all combined project that will result in that. Now, next year, I'm going to shift and start prepping a new version of Sense and Goodness Without God, which is my philosophy book, so that in 2025, which is its 20th anniversary, there will be a new edition of that or an updated version of that. So that's what's on my plate, and that, this year and next. And then plus all the usual stuff I'm always doing. I'm always blogging, always teaching and things like that. So people want to keep up with me, you can go to richardcarrier.info. That has, my social media like Twitter and Facebook. That's where you would go if you want to follow my announcements for new publications and new events like this. If you want to catch things like this, all that stuff is there. So you can find it through richardcarrier.info. You can also find my classes there. And my books and on my blog, which is one of the main things that I do now, is I do articles there in both philosophy and ancient history.
All right, cool. All right, so a couple of topics I want to touch on, and I'm giving the audience an opportunity to come in. If they want to come in and jump on the panel, they could come and ask you a question personally. This is the first time I'm doing it this way. Usually I just take the questions from the audience, but you could come in, ask a question, and then leave. Or if you want to have a conversation with Dr. Carrier, this is your perfect opportunity. This man is a PhD. He actually went to Columbia, one of the top universities in the United States of America. And he has a PhD primarily in history. I don't know what it surrounds, if it's ancient history, Roman history, but pretty much in history.
It's actually ancient. Well, it's Greco-Roman intellectual history. And my dissertation was on Roman science, but it was on the sociology of Roman science. So I touched on everything, religion, philosophy, science, and all of that. Primarily early Roman Empire, because that's when the origin of Christianity was. But my orbit goes from Greece to Rome, and that's what my specialty is. I have a secondary specialty in just publications, even peer-reviewed publications in modern contemporary naturalist philosophy. So I also have a dual track in my life. I'm doing both of those things. But this year I've been mostly focusing on my history side. But on my blog, you'll see philosophy topics come up. And if you're wondering, like, why do I do stuff in philosophy? And that's like, because I do have that other side of me.
Hey, one of the things when I was in school and I'm learning about history and everything is that I have to break the habits, because we argue so much on Facebook and social media. We got to break the habits of talking in absolutes. I'm guilty of that like 99% of the times. What do you want to tell the audience about, as far as, going back to your book, Proving History, you talk about how does someone go about it, and as far as a methodology and everything. What advice do you have for somebody like me who loves to talk in absolutes?
And I catch myself doing it too, and so I have to monitor and sometimes have to dial back or give a qualification, and I think that's important. I think we should do that as often as we can. I think there's the two tricks for me is, first, remember everything is about probabilities. So rather than black and white, true or false, think like, how probable are we talking about here? And then once you're in that mindset of like, how probable is this? If you're thinking that way all the time, then you will think about, oh, how absolute can I be? Like, how certain am I, or whatever. And then that will actually help you remember to qualify things, or remember to like put a probability on things, or even a probability range. You don't have to be mathematically precise. You could just like generally like, that's somewhat probable, or that's very probable, that's so probable I'm certain of it. You know, these kinds of things you can think of. And then the second thing is how do we get to those different probabilities? What is the justification for saying one thing is certain and, you know, it's a very high probability, and another thing is only mildly probable? Like, how do we tell the difference? What is it about things? And there's a number of stuff there that I write about on my blog, in my critical thinking category and my Bayes theorem category. But the general idea is you want to look for evidence, and you want to see like all the evidence, don't leave anything out, right? Everything pertinent. And you add it all up and you say, like, how probable is that evidence on the claim that I'm making? Like, if the claim I'm making is true, how expected is the evidence we have? And then compare that with the next most probable hypothesis, or the most plausible competing hypothesis. Like, well, if what I'm saying is not true, how likely is all this evidence that we're looking at? And the difference between those two likelihoods is our certainty. Like, if it's very big gap between certainties there, or probabilities there, then you're very certain. If the gap is small, then your certainty is lower. And there's certain tricks to how to think that way and how to figure that out. And like you mentioned, my book, Proving History, is partly about that. That's one of the things it talks about, how to do that. And like I said, on my blog, I discuss it in various ways as well.
There's a tradition. I know I've never heard you talked about this before, about Haile Selassie and the Ethiopian tradition about Menelik I and his mother, Queen of Sheba, having sex with Solomon in the Bible and having him as a child and so forth. So there's a lot of folks from my culture, Jamaica, who love the Rastafari, and I think it's just completely fake. But I mean,
yeah, I know a little bit about this because I used the Haile Selassie case as a counterexample for Jesus, right? Where that's a good case where it's highly mythologized person who existed, right? So it shows like it's totally possible to be that highly mythologized and still exist, right? So and people often don't read my book, so they don't know that I actually make this argument. It's like, totally agree. Being highly mythologized does not mean you didn't exist.
Right.
So the question is like, how do we know that about Selassie? Like, so my interest in that was like looking at the historical evidence for the man himself, right? Rather than the mythologies, I was less interested in the mythology of Rastafarianism. More interested in the evidence we have for Selassie, which is really good. And we have nothing like that for an ancient person. But so that's my one foray into Rastafarianism, was exposure to that, and a little bit, you know, the Bible and all the other things that are related to that. I grazed upon, but I didn't really go into a deep dive on. So I wouldn't consider myself an expert on Rastafari theology or anything like that.
The reason why I actually brought it up is because Menelik I, for him to be born and living in so-called Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is really not the Ethiopia today, is not really the Ethiopia that the Bible is talking about. So it's kind of confusing. But where he actually would have been in Ethiopia at the time, there was no archaeology there. There's no buildings. There's nothing up until like the 8th century BC. So we could draw a conclusion based on that, the probability of him existing and living there with his mom and carrying the Ark of the Covenant is actually
right. That's the other thing too, right? The Ethiopian church, the Ethiopian church to this day claims to have the Ark of the Covenant. That is another little detail here. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, I mean, I think like if you're gonna like try and sell a particular doctrine, you want to try and move things to fit the archaeology, right? And if you don't know the archaeology and you fix a date and you can't change it, and then the archaeology turns up bupkis, you're in trouble. This is a problem with religion, right? Like history can just adjust things, you know, adjust our hypothesis to fit the evidence, and then retest the hypothesis. Like, is our adjustment just an adjustment, or does it actually better fit the evidence? And does the evidence more prove it than alternatives? But no, religious theology won't let you do that. Yeah, so that can be an issue. I have not looked into that specific case, though, so I don't know that much about the archaeology behind supporting or not the Rastafari claims.
Right. All right, so let's get into this for a second here. Is the book of Daniel a forgery? I think for years I've studied this. I've looked at this for like probably 12 to 15 years. and I have my own personal feelings about it, whether it's a forgery or not. But why? What are a couple of the things that you look at to draw this conclusion?
Yeah, and of course, I'm coming to this on the shoulders of giants, as they say. Like, there's a lot of scholars who are serious experts in Daniel, for many decades, have built a body of evidence for this, and so my job as a historian is just to vet what they've come up with, and does it hold up? And yeah, it does. They're pretty much right. And so, and I haven't seen any good challenges to this either. That's the other thing, is I see challenges are uninformed rather than more informed, and that's usually the problem with this. But once you see that, then you know the consensus is pretty strong that Daniel was written in the 140s, right? Or the 160s. Sorry, it's written in the 160s BC as propaganda to support an ongoing rebellion. Basically, it's designed to support essentially the Maccabean rebellion against Seleucus and the Greek people who are conquering the land at that point. And there's lots of points that show this, but like one is like it gets all the history. It's supposed to have been written in the 8th century BC, but it gets everything wrong about that. It gets everything wrong, not just about history, but also about specific things that if you were in the court of the Persians at the time, you could not have gotten wrong. And so, yeah, it doesn't know 8th century history very well, but it knows 2nd century history very well. And then its predictions start to fail right around 165, 164 BC. And so you wonder, well, that's probably when it was written, right? It was written right when they knew the stuff really well. And it's the stuff that happened within the last 10 years of their lives. They nail it and pretend that it's a prediction made hundreds of years ago. But then once they get beyond their time, they fail. So their predictions fail at that point. And so historians generally conclude that that's how you can tell it was written then. And there's various pieces of evidence that lead to that. There's a few other pieces of supporting evidence that aren't as strong, but actually add to the case, like the existence of Greek loanwords in the Aramaic version of Daniel, which doesn't make a lot of sense. There should have been Persian loanwords, not Greek loanwords. Greek loanwords suggests Greek period, which suggests 2nd century BC, post Alexander the Great, not pre-Alexander the Great. Things like that. And then when you add up all the evidence, it becomes overwhelming. And this is a case where the probability of all that evidence existing and Daniel not being a forgery is so small, whereas the probability of all that evidence, if it is a forgery, is super high. So there's a huge gap between those two probabilities. And that's how we can be very certain, just very certain that Daniel's a forgery. The probability is very high. And there isn't really any way to change that outcome.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I looked at is the whole era with Nebuchadnezzar being the father of Belshazzar. If somebody was living in the court, I don't think that's an error that somebody would have made a couple of times. I mean, right. they try to come and say, well, son can mean grandson in Hebrew, and they try to make all these errors. But in in Daniel 5, it clearly states, that's my son, or I am the father of such and such. So it's not even the issue of son. But another issue I find that's major that I've seen Christians actually make up stuff to try to solve is the whole Daniel 5:31, where Belshazzar is called the last king of Babylon, and then Darius the Mede takes over and rule. Now that's one of the biggest problems in the Bible for Bible believers, that they try to solve it. They have made up even kings that don't exist in history to try to solve it.
Oh, it's true. Yeah. And I think. And I really think the authors of Daniel are thinking of the Darius. Like there's Darius the Great, who's very famous. He wasn't a Mede, but he existed roughly around the kinds of times they want. So they put him in there, but he actually comes much later and in an opposite order than they present. So they just re-identify him. They know the Medes are a thing back then. I know Darius is a thing roughly around then. So they put Darius the Mede in there to kind of, split the hair, as it were, or ride the thin edge of the knife. But no, it's not historically accurate, and we can show that there's no such person in charge of Persia or high ranking in Persia at the time, and so that doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I know for a fact that the Darius the Mede, I think it had to do with Jeremiah. Whoever wrote Daniel actually read Jeremiah.
Yes, that is true.
Isaiah. So they try to do is, because of the prophecy saying Darius the Medes will come after, and destroy Babylon because of what Babylon did to Judah and Egypt and whatever.
Yeah, that's also true. There's a lot of things going on in Daniel that are designed to rescue Jeremiah from being a false prophecy. And so, yeah, you see that kind of effect.
Yeah. All right. So Daniel, what about the prophecy of that Daniel is predicting or prophesying Jesus in the first century? That's one of the things that they talk about a lot.
Yeah. No more than Revelation is predicting modern events, right? The book of Revelation was predicting the end of the world within the author's lifetime. He was talking about events during his time. Had no conception of things sticking around another 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
He would have been appalled that God was going to wait that long. But people keep trying to reinterpret Revelation to apply to modern events, like scorpions become helicopters, etc. So that kind of stuff. Sign of the beast becomes credit cards, whatever. But that's that's not how it works. But there's much more interesting analyses of what the metaphors are in there. Like when he talks about the mark of the beast being on your wrist and your forehead, that's a reference to Tefillim, right? Which is if you were a very devout Jew, you would put small pieces of the Torah on a box on your head or a box on your wrist. And that's how you represent, that's how you sold the fact that you were very holy. So if you're to put the mark of the beast in those places, you're essentially replacing God with whatever secular authority that you're submitting to. And so it's a really good symbol for giving up God for some sort of secular authority. And so that's what it's really about. It has nothing to do with like us getting like government tattoos on our wrists, right? It's not microchips. There's no microchip. They had no conception. But yeah, so Daniel's the same way. Like you can keep reinterpreting it. And in fact, they did. This is the thing. I do think that Jews trying to, because Daniel failed, like its own prophecy. So essentially you start with Jeremiah. Jeremiah's prophecy fails. It does not line up right. So Daniel was written to fix Jeremiah, to fix his failed prophecy, to make it work out right. Mm-hmm. And also at the same time promote the war. But then Daniel fails because Daniel's continuation of the prophecy fails. So rather than just say Daniel and Jeremiah are false prophets, many, if not most Jews decided, well, we must have misunderstood. And so then they kept trying to repackage Daniel, reinterpret Daniel to refer to other people. Mm-hmm. And we have this at Qumran where they're trying to apply it to their own leaders somehow, or maybe even themselves as a community or whatever. So you've got that going on. And then, so when the Christians come along, it's clear they've done it for them. That's how they came up with their ideas. They're trying to reinterpret Daniel. They came up with Christianity, and boom, we get Christianity, which is another attempt to fix the false prophecy of Daniel. And then, of course, the whole history of Christianity after that is trying to fix the failed prophecy of Jesus, that the world would end within a lifetime
of Jesus, yeah. Right? Matthew 24.
Lifetime of those present, not the lifetime of Jesus, right? So that was the marketing sell. And that didn't happen either. And so, but what do you get? You get reinterpretations rather than rejecting the prophet. You get reinterpretations of what the prophet must have meant. And that's what happened to Daniel as well.
All right. Let's get to, for years ago, I did an interview with you and we talked about Brother Jabari from Osazi. And, we were trying to set up a debate. He tried to reach out to you and we trying to get him to do it. I think it's about that time because I think he's kind of scared because of what you might do to him with this topic of Egypt. Right. I mean, Christianity stealing from Egypt. I think it's such a worn out topic now, and it's so sad at this point. Yeah. People are still holding on to this.
Anyone in the audience who wants to catch up to what we're talking about here, on my blog, just look up Kemitism. That's Kemi. So Kemitism, look it up on my blog, and I have a whole article on this subject. And then that provoked a lot of like angry responses, but then there's like, well, let's have a debate. And then, yeah, that debate never came together. I won't speculate on why, but
I will though. You don't have to. I will. I think Jabari is terrified of a PhD from Columbia beating the brakes off of him with that pseudo nonsense that he teaches. It's just facts. I mean, you might say I hate Jabari, whatever you want to say. I don't really care at this point. But the truth of the matter is, I hate misinformation. And one of the biggest things in this community is the whole everything is stolen from Egypt. I mean, I was talking to somebody on Clubhouse 2 days ago, and I said, Garfield, what do you think about monotheism? And there's a gentleman by the name of, what is his name again? Is it Spencer, Elliot Spencer, or Elliot something? He talked about in Syria, before the pyramid text, they had a writing that talked about he called it soft monotheism. How he
Mhm.
found a text that talks about God and independently talking about him creating the world and all that stuff. And he said this is soft monotheism. It already existed. But if you listen to everybody, oh, Akhenaten and you know this one, and they gave it to the Bible, and you know, but it's already circulating even probably before the Syrian text. People are talking in general.
Yeah,
with
and
these
we've got it
ideas.
going on in Persia too, right?
Mhm.
It's also important to note that people often misuse the word monotheism. So Judaism of the time of Christianity was not properly monotheistic. It was what's called monolatrist, which means to worship only one God. It wasn't that they denied the existence of other gods. It's that they called them evil subordinate gods. Gods like fallen angels, for example, were often actually called gods, but they were false gods. They were false gods because they weren't the one true God. But they're still equal in paganism, where like you talk about all the gods in polytheism, they're all like not omnipotent gods. They're super powerful. They live forever. They have their own particular domains that they control. Like Poseidon controls weather for in the sea, for example. But when you look at the angels, like the good angels, and you look at the fallen angels and the demons, they're exactly the same. Like, so apart from the name, the fact that they're called angels and demons, apart from the name, they are identical to the pagan gods. And so really, and so a lot of Judaism had a full pantheon of gods. They just only reserved the name of God, the name God, the label, the sort of honorific to call something a God properly. They reserved that for the one God that they chose as the true God, right? And so that's why they would only call that God God. But it wasn't because they thought that there were no other gods. It's because they didn't think you should worship any other gods. And so it isn't really monotheist. And once you see that, then you start to see like this, which is called henotheism. You see this all over the ancient world. Like the pagans were like henotheism starts as early as we have Greek writing. We see discussions of henotheistic ideas, and where you have like one supreme god, and then all the other gods are subordinate or warring with that one supreme god. And even Zoroastrians, the Persians, they have the two gods, right? They have the supreme god, and then they have sort of this devil figure that fights against him. And so even that's like, and so even in Judaism, when they have a devil fighting God, you've got two gods basically. It's just out of respect for their God, they don't call the devil God. But that's just semantics, right? So when you're looking at like the actual ontologies of these religion, they aren't monotheistic in the way they are today. So the modern monotheism is much more hardcore than it was back then. And so once you see that, then it's easier to see this pattern growing everywhere. It wasn't just. It wasn't even Egypt wasn't even very popular. Like Akhenaten's movement was basically overthrown and didn't stick around. But it's all coming up around the same time. I think like the Persians and the Egyptians are both coming up with these ideas roughly around the same time. And then the Persian idea stuck in Persia. Zoroastrianism remained big for a very long time. It didn't stick in Egypt. But it is true that the Jewish ideas, their monotheism, if you want to call it that, henotheism, whatever you want to call it, is much later than Akhenaten. And in fact, it's later than even the Bible claims, right? So it really looks like possibly just before or after the exile. There are some scholars now who are saying centuries even later than that even after the exile, the idea that they started pushing monotheism after the Persian exile, the Jews did, even that is a myth of the Old Testament. And there's a few scholars arguing that lately, like under peer review, like not cranks. I'm not fully persuaded yet, but all scholars generally agree that this sort of monotheistic push really only starts like 6th century BC or so, and in Judaism. And then the Old Testament is kind of built to push this. And you can see hints of it in like Ezekiel and these other authors who really rag on Jews not buying onto the program, and they're still weeping for Tammuz. There's a passage in Ezekiel, like they're still like worshiping the Asherah poles and things like that. So this paganism is going on all over the Jewish territory, and the priestly attempt to get everybody to like snap in line and follow this new kind of push for a monotheistic or monolatrist worldview wasn't very successful at first, but it became successful over time. But it was still a late development. It wasn't really that early. And so I don't think you could say that the Jews invented the idea. But also, I don't think you say that the Egyptians did either, because it looks like an idea that several people came up with independently of each other. Oh, your audio is dead.
Oh, yeah. I was saying the Native American culture, they have their own little thing that's going on over here too. So
Some
you
of
know,
those models can be described as henotheistic, yeah, where you have the one supreme creator being, right, the creator, as the supreme god, and all the other gods are subordinate in some way. Yeah, absolutely. That fits the same model. Once you see it ontologically, what the model looks like, then you see it everywhere. It's not really that unusual.
Right. As far as Egypt, as far as what do you see them influencing Christianity? I mean, some of the claims is, the virgin birth. They always claim resurrection. They claim the Ten Commandments. They claim a lot of stuff. But let's talk about the virgin birth first, because they like to bring up the what is it, Hatshepsut, or some magical birth scene they have with I forgot what it's called.
Well, let's see. Neith is one of the examples, but yeah, Egypt has its virgin-born gods, but so did a lot of cultures. That's the other things we can't. But of course, they're born of gods, virgin gods, right? So it's a goddess who creates. Even Athena, has a virgin birth of her own type. Or Athena's the product. I can't remember. Wait, is she the product of the virgin birth? Oh, I'm forgetting right now. If you want to find that out, I've got a whole list called Virgin Birth on my blog. You can go. People who are watching, go there, and I list all of the precedents. Now, none of the precedents exactly match what the Christians do, and that's because the Christians take ideas from a bunch of different places and pull them together. Each idea comes from somewhere, but the combination is unique. And that's the same is true for all religions. Every religion is unique in its combination of ideas, but the individual ideas are rarely unique. They're usually new. They're usually old ideas being borrowed from somewhere else. And this is one of those. So I don't think, I think the people who are inventing, now, first of all, I don't think the virgin birth existed as the concept when Christianity began. First of all, like, I think that was invented later. So it's like, it's not in Mark. Right, you get it. It only shows up in Matthew and then in Luke. But even John gets rid of it. Like, so it wasn't really. It was kind of a late idea to even sort of describe Jesus by this hero model of the virgin birth. So even that wasn't original. I don't think that was the case. But when you're looking at that and you see the different models of it, I don't think you can. I can say that they would know about the Egyptian models for sure. When I don't think there's any argument that there's some sort of like intellectual barrier, like a magic wall between Egypt and Judea. They're right next to each other, but no ideas flowed from Egypt to Judea. That's not true. So I'm sure they were aware of Egyptian models of this, but they were also aware of models of this from other cultures, because it was common everywhere. And at that time, they would have had no way to figure out who had the earliest version, right? Like they couldn't archaeologically determine that Egypt came up with it first, or that Greece did, or whoever, right? They didn't know. All they knew is that this virgin birth idea was all over the place, right? So it's an available idea that they can extract to build their own hero out of. And so I don't think they're like deliberately picking Egypt as the influence. Egypt is just among the examples that were available to them. And so they just saw it was everywhere, and everybody's got one, so we should have one, is basically the idea. So I think that's the proper way to look at the influencing factor. It isn't just that they're getting the idea from Egypt, but it's also not that they're not unaware. It's not that they're unaware of the Egyptian idea either.
What about the idea of I think there's something on the wall where they're trying to say the virgin birth. I think Amenhotep III or something like that. There's some sort of birth that's going on. You did an article on this years ago where you break it down.
Oh yeah, that wasn't Akhenaten. Yeah, so that's the birth. I think that's the of Horus, right? So the birth of Horus, but via Osiris. And it's a very early text. It appears on it's inscribed on the walls of pyramid texts, so it goes back very far. And that's definitely a sexual reproduction. It's not a virgin reproduction. We can see that from the text. The images might be vague as to what's actually going on, but they do not depict the virgin birth, and they don't model any of the other features. There's no 3 wise men. There's no, like, these things that are claimed, or when you go and look and check the original sources, they're not there. So people who are interested in that, that's that Luxor thing. So if you go to my blog, look for that Luxor thing. So Luxor, and I have 2 articles on it. And you can read about it there. But yeah, that doesn't hold up at all.
What about the whole resurrection part that they talk about?
Now, that's another example. So Osiris's resurrection is well established as being a well-known belief at that time all over the Mediterranean. But so are the resurrections of many others. And I do have an article on this, Dying and Rising Gods. You can go check that on my blog as well. But yeah, the Syrians had our Dying and Rising God. The Romans did. The Greeks had more than one. So these Dying and Rising gods were all over the place. And again, the people of the first century would have no way of knowing who came up with it first. All they know is that everybody's got one, including Egypt. And so they wanted one too. And it fit with their own particular, the Jewish ideology of resurrection. They'd come up with the idea of like resurrection in stages. So the Messiah would be resurrected first, and then the saints, and then, so on down the line. And so the idea of Jesus' resurrection became the beginning of the general resurrection. It became a sign of the end of the world. The end of the world is happening now, people. Time to step up, right? That's the way they were selling it. But yeah, they're aware of the Osiris resurrection model, but they're also aware of all these other resurrection models. And so they just see this model everywhere. And that's how they're adopting the idea. And of course, they adapt it in their own way. They make it a Jewish version of it. But yeah, they're aware of the Egyptian model.
Do you think, I always think about this, the whole thing, I always tell people that Christianity has the best game in town. And I think different religions are trying to compete, whether it's Islam with the Midrashic writing or whatever they have with the 70 virgins when you die. I just think people are trying to compete with Christianity. And because I think Christianity is telling us that, hey, you know what, if you believe in what we believe in, whether it's foolishness or not, you're gonna physically come back to life.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know of any other group teaching of this physical body coming back to life, or you coming back in a physical form. And I think that is so attractive, and and it's crazy how I know Candida Moss did some stuff about the persecutions and all that stuff. What is true persecution and what is the true story behind it?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to figure out, is that what was so attractive about Christianity at that time? Two things. The fact that they stood up to the Roman government as far as not wanting to do oath or oath swearing, which we're going to talk about with the Matthew 2, Luke 2 stuff, and then faking diplomas and trying to fake that they did the oath or whatever. But is it that they stood up to the Romans, they didn't want to worship their deities, and the fact that you're going to come back to life, possibly in a physical body?
Yeah, the Christians sold that idea, right? It's like, well, we're so stalwart that we must be right? We're willing to die for our beliefs, therefore our belief must be true. They use that as a marketing tactic. There's not really any evidence that worked as a marketing tactic. So that's the other side of things. It's like, well, what actually worked? Like, why were people converting to Christianity? And of course, the answer changes over time. This is the other thing. It's not one thing. Like, the key thing to note is, like, when Christianity began, it wasn't even looking at Gentiles other than to convert them to Judaism. So Christians started as Jewish. You had to be Torah observant. You had to be circumcised, the whole deal. And if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to circumcise your penis. You had to start a Jewish dietary, follow the dietary laws. You had to obey the Sabbath and all these things. Now, Paul comes along and he sees that this other thing going on that had been going on for a long time, which is that there were a lot of Gentiles who were really, really, really liked Judaism in various ways. They liked the regimentality of it. Maybe they liked the resurrection promise, but they especially seem to like sort of the camaraderie and the fraternality of it. And there's a lot of people I say, like, we're talking a small percentage of the population, but enough to look like gettable audience, right? The people who like this idea of a very regimented, strict society that had this sort of camaraderie with it. And so this was attractive to people, but no one wanted, or not no one, but a lot of people didn't want to fully convert. They didn't want to cut off a piece of their penis. They didn't want to follow the dietary laws and stuff. So they became God-fearers. They became these Gentiles who sort of supported the Jews and Jewish synagogues, but they never became Jews. Now this audience is sitting there just waiting to be, poached, essentially. And so Paul says, well, what if I give them Judaism without circumcision and dietary laws? Then I'll have a hugely marketable product. And so that's what happened at first, right? That's how Christianity exploded into the Gentile sphere, because Paul went around telling them that you can be a Jew without being a Jew. And so everybody's like, that's a great idea. And so that's your first burst of Christian recruitment. Now, once you burned through that entire market, and that's a very small market already, so we're still talking like below 1% of the population, hardly anything. But once you've done that, the next step is, how do you keep converting people? And then it starts to become a lot of the traditional ways. Well, you're born into it. Well, your friend became one. Your dad did, and now everybody in your family has to do what your dad did. Like that kind of stuff, which is just straightforward social approach to getting people to convert. And yeah, there's some people who are going to it for the attractions. Like they like the complex theology. They find that attractive, and so they get into it. Some people have random like dreams that tell them they should be Christians and not Osirian, while others are having random dreams to tell them to be Osirian and not Christian, right? So you've got kind of like random and also social reasons to grow. And the growth rate is the same regardless of religion. So the growth rate of Christianity, when you look at all the data, is the same as the growth rate of Mormonism. So arguably the same things that the Mormons use to convert people, and these will be converts from already existing religions that are already resurrection based, right? So the Mormons are poaching Christians who already believe in a resurrection. So it's not the resurrection, it's the appeal. The Mormons are selling something else that people are finding appealing. And it's usually social things. It's just the camaraderie, it's the support of the church, or it's new and not old, or it fits the new circumstances, or whatever. They're selling something that just is appealing to people. And the same thing, I think, is happening in the second and third century of Christianity. And then in the fourth century, they get super lucky and they get an emperor. And once they've got an emperor supporting the church, well, now it becomes politically useful to be a Christian. So now people are joining Christianity to get ahead, to get in with the elite crowd and so forth. And then, 50 years later, you get Theodosius, who just outlaws everything else and says, well, you got to be a Christian. You got to be a Christian. And then that's it, right? And then after that, you've got conquests and diplomacy. So like there's a lot of diplomacy. You say, we're going to invade your country unless your king converts to Christianity. And of course, the people of a nation will join the religion of their king. And so like there's this kind of like political approach to Christian missionizing. And that's how it goes, right? Like that's how the actual thing goes. At any point, was resurrection the attraction? It's possible. And there's been several scholars who've made arguments that resurrection beliefs already existed all over the ancient world. But I think that the one thing that was different, like Judaism was hard to convert to, Christianity was easy. Also, everybody hated the Jews, right? So Christianity actually had an emperor. So like that became like the popularity argument, right? It's easier to be a Christian. And so that kind of did it. So if you wanted to be in a resurrection cult, Christianity was the only game in town until the Muslims came along, right? Now there were the Zoroastrians, but they weren't converting people. That was the other thing, is they were a resurrection cult, but you had to be born into it. They weren't converting people anymore come this time, which is a bad decision for the Zoroastrians, but that's why they've declined. Whereas the Christians have grown and the Muslims have grown and stuff. So I do think, yeah, maybe there's some sign of the resurrection cult idea is there, that there's something about the appeal of getting your body back rather than living in sort of some sort of vague other world in the afterlife. And so, yeah, I do think there's something to that. And like I said, there's a few scholars who've written arguments and books studying this specific aspect of it. And I think it also affected the politics of Christianity going forward as well. So a good book to read on this is Caroline Bynum. She did a book on resurrection. I think resurrection is in the title. I'm forgetting the whole title right now. But Caroline Bynum, that's Bynum with a Y. She's written on this. And there are some others. I just did an article on controversial views that have now become widely supported. And in there is Dying and Rising Gods. And there's actually two books, two peer-reviewed studies in my list there that both argue that the existence of resurrection beliefs already in paganism made it easier for Christianity to market itself to those people because the idea was already familiar to them and they could actually sell it. And they were just better at it for whichever reason. And so, yeah, so if people are interested in that, you can pursue those resources.
All right. Anybody wants to press the link? The link is at the top of the room. If you want to jump on and ask Dr. Carrier a question or have a conversation, you are welcome to jump on and have a dialogue. Or if you want to post a question from the chat, the floor is yours. This is a Q&A. I shouldn't even be talking. It shouldn't even be an interview. So if anyone wants to jump on and ask a question, let's get it in, man. We're gonna talk about Matthew 2 and Luke 2, and my brother Triller, he's gonna jump on in a few minutes, and we're gonna get into that. But in the meantime, if anyone has a question, let me see if there's any questions in the chat that I could get into and so forth. Let me ask you this: do you other than the whole Jesus existence stuff and the Daniel forgery, what other topics and proven history? What other topics do you normally get into as far as as far as coming from you?
The field is very wide, but if we just limit it to history subjects, because I also do philosophy. Remember, that's a whole other side of me. I do modern philosophy, but in history, I've done a lot of interesting stuff. History of science and technology is a big thing that I do, and my dissertation was on that. So people are interested in that. I've done a lot of books and articles on that subject. Another weird thing that's out of left field is I actually ended up kind of making a small impact on Hitler studies. There's a whole story. We could do a whole show just on this, but I was hired by Freedom from Religion Foundation to check some quotations of Hitler where people were claiming Hitler was an atheist, to check them in the German. And so, and that, you know, I can translate German. So I said, I'll do that. They paid me $50, and that ended up being a huge rabbit hole where I ended up having to publish a peer-reviewed study in German Studies Review, demonstrating that our English version of Hitler's Table Talk, which is this huge source we have for the ideas of Hitler, that it's fraudulent. And that in fact it does not accurately translate or reliably translate to German. And there's a whole weird backstory to that as to how that happened. And that article led to Mikael Nielsen, who's a Swedish professor. He went full Dan Brown on this, and he like traveled the world and dug into archives and found letters and talked to living witnesses and stuff. And then wrote this whole book called Hitler Redux, where it's just all about this, where he took what I found and like fully deep dived it, and has completely surpassed what I did on that, and really thoroughly analyzed the history of this text. And the one lesson you get from that is there's a universal rule that you can always trust, is that Nazis are always liars. All the Nazis are liars. Like, it's just every Nazi that he talks to, he disproves everything they say. It's like, it's like, wow, one more Nazi shown to be a liar, just over and over again. Nazis are just liars. Wow. And so you just got to be aware of that. Anyway, so I actually have a weird expertise in a little niche of Hitler studies as well, which is, World War II German studies. But so that, that's just an example off the top of my head. Okay. There are probably other things I've discussed that I'm forgetting now, but
all right.
We've got a question from the audience.
Yeah, by estimation, what percentage of the Bible does Dr. Carrier think is forged or false?
So the Bible would mean Old Testament and New Testament. Now, I'm less versed on the Old Testament, so I can't get, and that's a problematic question, because you have like Isaiah, scholars generally agree is multiple redactions, so half of it is authentic and the other half is forged, right? And so sometimes it's different patches of chapters. So like, that's a complicated question. Is you can't just say Isaiah was forged. Like, some of it's authentic and some of it is forged. So that's a complicated question to answer. I can't answer that one. I mean, if I were to guess, God, it also depends on what you mean by forged. So that's the other thing. Is like, so you have the first 5 books, right? The tradition is that Moses wrote those, but the books themselves don't claim Moses wrote them. So normally, like, a forgery is something that's claimed to be written by someone, but the books don't say they're written by Moses. So they aren't technically forgeries, even though they're completely false, like they're completely made up, right? So like, none of those things happen. Nothing in Deuteronomy happened. Nothing in Exodus happened. It's all made up. But they aren't represented as forgeries. So that's the other aspect of that. So if you just said like made up, I'd say like most of it, certainly close to half at best. But if you mean specifically forgeries, Daniel is the only one I've studied, and that's because it exists very strongly in the Greek tradition, as well as a complex Greek tradition for Daniel. Daniel's the only one I've studied, and because it comes up a lot, and so that's the only one I know really well. And I can't really speak to the other books with confidence on that. There are other scholars who could do that better than me. Now, in the New Testament, we know half the letters of Paul are forgeries. So I think that's 7. I think there's 14 letters. Am I right? I can't remember exactly, but 7 are authentic, and I think 7 are, maybe it's not 7. I don't know, but there's so basically 7 are authentic. The other Paulines are forgeries.
Mm-hmm.
We have 1st and 2nd Peter. Now we know for a fact 2nd Peter is a forgery. Most scholars think 1st Peter is a forgery. I'm actually a lone dissenter. I actually think it's authentic, but I'm a weirdo. But most scholars think it's also a forgery. And then the others are doubted. So like James and John and Jude. Now I think James and Jude are authentic, but they don't claim to be by the brothers of Jesus. So like they're just by guys named James and Jude, right? So they don't even claim to be the apostles, right? They just by whoever. The Johannines, I think, are forged. I think there's a good case for that. There are scholars who disagree, but the majority of scholars think that they're forgeries. So that's 3. Johannines are 3 texts. And so 7 of Paul's texts. So now we're at 10. And then when you get to the rest, like they don't say they're by authors that are fake. So, like Hebrews doesn't say who it's by. So you can't really say that's a forgery. And Revelation, it just says it's by John the Elder. It doesn't claim to be any specific John. And there's a zillion Johns. So I don't know how it's 27 books in the New Testament. And so I've already counted up a third of those, right? More than a third as forgeries. And that's on the conservative side. Like there are scholars who would add to that number of forgeries that are in. If you add Peter, then that's 11. So we're getting close to half, right? Yeah, so a lot. It's always close to half. Just that's probably a good rule of thumb. What have we got?
All right. This gentleman, he's referring to Egypt, of course. What about the motifs concerning Jesus and his life? Him as the Word and the Sacred Heart, for instance, associated with wood, baptism, the crook and the flail, fish, grain, bread, wine, 2 women, and resurrection, etc.
That's too many things. I can't answer that question. And it's also not specific, so I don't know what's being questioned here. Like some of these, I'm not really sure even what the Sacred Heart refers to and all of that. So yeah, I'm sorry, the question's too imprecise to give an answer to. The only general answer I can say is that I personally think the biographies of Jesus, the Gospels, are completely made up. I think to give you an example, if you want to really get a feel for this, is I wrote an article on, a bunch of scholars agree with me on this, and I wrote an article on and cite them and list their scholarship, but on how Paul is based on the how Mark is based on the epistles of Paul, where Mark takes things that Paul said and turns them into things Jesus said or stories about Jesus. And once you see that, like you see how that's happening, you're like, oh my God, this guy's just making everything up, right? And then the same goes, when you look at the later authors, they're just making up more stuff. So I think it's all made up. And I would think most scholars agree that most of it is made up. I think that's the fair thing to say. Is the mainstream consensus is that what's in the Gospels is mostly made up. And then the disagreements arise on which pieces aren't made up. And so there's a lot of debate about that, a lot. So even among historicists, I'm not just talking about the mythicism debate.
Right. I think what he's referring to is motifs concerning Jesus' life and Egypt. I would say the 2 women.
I see.
Right. That's what he's trying to say.
Yeah. I missed that. I missed that connection. You're right.
Yeah.
Because this probably is referencing what we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Okay, now let me look at this list again with that in mind.
I will say the 2 women and resurrection is false. It's actually 3 women.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah. No, I would say none of these things come from Egyptian mythology. They could have, like, there's nothing, and there are things I actually think do. What would be an example? So no, actually, it's all debatable. So it's hard to really place that. But none of these things do. I think this stuff has other roots and other bases for being there. And some things are just coincidences. To give you an example, so the Egyptians, certainly the Greek version, or I should say the Greek influenced version of Osiris cult. And this would be a version of the cult that existed before Christianity arose, for a couple hundred years at least. In that version of the cult, Osiris dies at a full moon. Is it full moon? Yeah, dies at the full moon and then resurrects at the end of the full moon. So it's 3 days of the full moon. And that's also true for Jesus, because Passover also tracks the full moon because it's a lunar calendar. Now, does that mean that the Christians borrowed this idea of a death and resurrection matching the lunar calendar of the full moon, that they borrowed it from Osiris? Not necessarily, because the Jews had their own reasons for wanting the death and resurrection to match the Passover narrative. And I talk about those reasons in my article on the earthquake. There's the crucifixion earthquake. There's a guy who did a documentary recently on this, and I have a whole section on dating the crucifixion, and it goes into the theological reasons why they dated it the way they did. And so there's very, very good reasons for them to have come up with this dating in their forgery of the timeline of it that have nothing to do with Egypt. And I think it just happens to be that they both use lunar calendars, and the full moon just happens to be affiliated with a notion of resurrection in both cultures. And I think this is just a coincidence. I don't think it was borrowing. But it does show that like the same ideas are coming. The people are coming up with the same ideas based on the same symbolism, right? So, so that's true. But I don't think they're just stealing the idea from Osiris. I personally think that the idea, when I talk about mythicism and my mythicist model, which is the only one that's passed peer review, is the idea that originally they thought Jesus died and rose in a celestial realm, and like in the firmament, which is the realm below the moon where dying and decay can happen. And then he resurrects. He gets killed by a Satan up there and then resurrects and goes back up. This is exactly what Plutarch says the Greek version of Osiris cult was preaching about Osiris, that he descends below the moon, just below the moon, and is killed by Typhon, which is the equivalent, Set, the equivalent of Satan. Mm-hmm. And then he resurrects and ascends. And so this model is exactly the same that fits the narrative that we have, all the evidence, the sort of clues that we have about Christianity. So I think that's a definite lift, but this is a lift from an already modified version of Egyptian cult. Like this version of Egyptian cult was already influenced by Platonism and Greek culture. So it's an altered version. So it's a hybrid of Egyptian and Greek ideas before it even gets to Christianity. Right. And so that's the kind of complexity that we're dealing with here. It's hard to answer these questions in absolute terms.
All right. Is there validity to Andrew Steinman's arguments that Herod died in 1 BC? Yeah. We're going to get into that. So I just wanted to post this just to let you know we're going to talk about
it. Yeah.
All right.
The short answer is no, but yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get into that real quickly. Let me see who else. Garfield asks Dr. Carrier if he stands on some of Paul's letters and some of Isaiah being forgeries are based on writing style, and what else is leading him to those conclusions.
Actually, I don't know for Isaiah. I just follow the consensus of Isaiah scholars on this. So I don't know how they're coming to their decisions. I can only speak to the Greek stuff. So Paul, yeah, absolutely. It's stylistic, what we call stylometric evidence. And there's a multiple different kinds of evidence. Some are things that you can't forge. So like average sentence length. How you use punctuation, or in Greek, you would use what are called particles, which serve the function of punctuation. How you use these things, authors just intuitively use them a certain way. They don't think about them that they have to copy them, like, because they're hard to copy. Like you have to do statistical analysis to know what you're supposed to copy and then do it. And they didn't do statistical analyses back then. So forgers didn't know how to do these things. And so you can catch them with these statistical analyses of style. But even without that, now that's kind of like locked it in. Like once we were doing stats on the letters of Paul, it confirmed what scholars had been saying before. But scholars before were basing it just on vocabulary and grammar. So the way Paul uses words changes weirdly. Like it's very consistent in the 7 letters that we think are authentic, but then it's different in the other letters. And in fact, they're different even across those letters. So like the pastoral epistles do all look like they were written by one person, but they were not Paul. In fact, their style is more like Luke and Acts, much more like, to the point that some scholars have suggested it's the same author. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it could represent the same period of time, or that the authors of the pastorals was influenced by Luke. But definitely not the same thing. So yeah, there's a variety of different ways to do stylometrics. And if you want an example of stylometrics without the statistics, the statistical models are really complicated. So those are difficult to discuss. But the without statistics, just standard stylometrics. If you look at that, in my book, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, which will be relevant because that's where I have my Luke and Matthew nativity dating stuff. So we're going to talk about that later tonight, right? So if you want the definitive list of scholars and all that stuff on that question, when did Herod die? When does Matthew say Jesus was born? When does Luke say it? I have a whole chapter on that in there, and I've looked at every possible excuse that apologetics has come up and do it all. But in that same book, I have analysis of the long ending of Mark. So the long ending of Mark is everything after verse 16:8 in Mark. We all agree, all scholars agree that's forgery. Even the fundamentalists, there's fundamentalists who agree it's a forgery, but they insist that the forgery was inspired, so it still counts as scripture. That's actually an argument in the field. But anyway, we all agree that it's forged. And what I do is I show why, and then I answer again all the apologetics to try and deny it, or that have been attempted throughout history. But what I do there is I show you what a stylistic analysis looks like. And we're really lucky in that the author of that long ending of Mark, I don't think was trying to pretend to be Mark. I think it was in another piece of literature and it got moved into Mark. And B, their style was so different from Mark's that even though it's only a short number of verses, it's like 20 verses, not even 20 verses. Even though it's a short number of verses, the style differences are so stark. And if you want to see what we mean by a style difference, that chapter will give you many examples of what this kind of thing looks like. And we do this a lot in analyzing the authenticity of texts in the ancient world. And I imagine that was done with the Hebrew of Isaiah. I like I said, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I haven't done that. I haven't looked into that. But when it comes to Paul, yeah, definitely. It's all stylometric evidence.
All right. This is from more of like, I forgot what the gentleman's name is, but is it possible that Jesus was a half Nabatean prince born to an Essene's handmaid?
Well, it's not probable, right? I mean, it's more probable. I mean, it's more possible than that he's a Klingon, because at least half Nabatean princes in concept existed back then. Essene's handmaidens in principle existed back then. So, like, it's possible. But no, I wouldn't regard it as probable. There's no evidence for either of these conjectures.
All right. Any connection with Jesus and the Germanic Jesus? I've heard this a lot.
I don't know anything about the Germanic Jesus, so I can't comment on that. What I would look at, though, if you're interested in that, is when does the Germanic Jesus appear in the sources? So, like, is this Christianity influencing Germanic religion? This is a problem because most of our evidence regarding Germanic religion is post-Christian influence, and thus doesn't necessarily represent anything before Christian influence. And so that's a complicated question. Since I haven't studied this specific one, I can't advise you, but I would just just put a caution in, is you need to really track where do the earliest sources for the Germanic Jesus come from, and what did they actually say? And that's where you would start with the timeline question.
All right. Let me get Sunchild again. Any connection with God and the Lombardic Gadan?
I don't know Lombardic, so I can't comment on that.
All right. Let me see if there's anybody wants to jump on the panel. By the way, you're free to jump on. Did Paul modify Philo's high priest ideas?
I don't know. Well, that's too vague to answer specifically, but I can give the general answer is that I do think that Paul has read Philo. He might not have read everything Philo wrote, because they're Florowitz, they overlap. So Philo's starting to write in roughly the 20s through the 40s, and Paul is writing in the 50s AD. So definitely it's possible for Paul to have read all of Philo's writings. I doubt he read all of them, but I do believe that he read many of them, and many scholars agree that it's totally possible that he did. So I do think there's been influence. It's also possible they have common influences. In other words, Philo's also reading people that we don't have. So a lot of stuff you find in Philo might not be Philo. It might be him just repeating things that other scholars have said. And Paul might be reading those same scholars, and so you might be seeing common influence, where Paul didn't read Philo, but Paul and Philo read the same whoever, that we don't have, and that's why their ideas line up. But there's a lot of overlaps between Paul and Philo, like in weird things too, like the double atoms theory. There's two atoms. There's the true atom and the earthly atom and the spiritual atom and all of this stuff. They are not identical. So Paul is not lifting Philo directly. He's changing Philo, or he's getting ideas from sources that influence Philo. We don't really know. But there's a lot of things in Paul that look like Philo in a lot of ways. So we do think that there is some sort of connection one way or another. So that this idea is possible. And it is possible that Paul is modifying these ideas. That's also totally possible.
Okay. Let me see who else we got. We got my brother Sabio. How accurate is Raphael Latester in his on questioning the historicity of Jesus and his criticisms of the mainstream scholars?
I have yet to see a valid criticism of Latester. And people have had tons of time to come up with one, to find some serious mistake in Latester. I have some disagreements with Lataster's arguments, but I don't think there's anything that's factually wrong. To give you an example, I don't agree. I don't think that his argument for interpolations based on Marcionism, his argument for interpolations in Paul, I don't think that's a strong enough argument to run with. I'm not convinced, but it's at least an argument that you have to deal with. Like, he's not making stuff up, right? Like, he is making an argument, and it is valid in terms of its factual premises. But how strongly it leads to the conclusion, that's the part where you can dispute. So I don't agree with everything Latester says, but everything he says is pretty solid. Like, even when I think he's wrong, he's still making a completely respectable argument that needs to be dealt with. Like, you can't just dismiss it. And so, yeah, in terms of, I haven't seen any like criticism of Lataster's book, or any of his books, frankly, that gives me pause. I think he's done a pretty solid job.
All right. Was his book peer reviewed, by the way?
Well, there's done several, right? So I assume we're talking about Questioning the Historicity of Jesus, which was published by Brill, which is one of the most respected peer-reviewed academic presses. So it definitely was peer-reviewed, yeah.
All right. Let me see what else we got. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to come on and have a conversation, it's free time. Let's go. Why is the Messiah said to come from Galilee and being a Nazarene from Nazor? Was there when there was no Nazor? I don't know what's.
Yeah, I know what he's talking about. There's two questions here. The first is Galilee, and we know the answer to this one. That's Isaiah 9:1. It says it. It says, the gospel of God is going to come from Galilee. So they have to say he comes from Galilee. Now, of course, Bethlehem's not in Galilee. So if another prophet says the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem, and another prophet says that he's going to come from Galilee, you have a problem. How do you make these two things true? Well, you got to find a town in Galilee that will fit. And Matthew says that Scripture said that he would be a Nazorian. And you're absolutely right. There's no town that matches a Nazorian. It's clearly not a town. Whatever scripture he's referring to has been lost. It was probably a variant reading or another scripture that we don't have. And we know a lot of that was the case back then. So we don't know, because we don't have that scripture. So we don't know what that scripture actually meant or said. But it probably was saying something other than a town. It was probably saying something like Nazarite, or some sort of Aramaic term that might mean like watchers or keeper of secrets or things. There's been a variety of suggestions that have been made in the scholarship. We're not sure. If you get my book Proving History and look up Nazareth in the index, I have a whole section where I survey some of the scholarship on this. I also have a section on the historicity of Jesus on this. But one thing we know is it's not a town, but it's close-ish to Nazareth. Now, you would normally say something other than Nazorian. For someone from Nazareth would not be called a Nazorian. They'd be called something close to that, but not spelled exactly the same. But so I think that's what happened. So I think Scripture said Galilee, Isaiah 9, verse 1, and Scripture said Bethlehem. Okay, so we need a town in Galilee for him to come, and we need this complicated story to explain how he could come from both places. And then they found this, he would be a Nazorian scripture somewhere that's in a scripture that doesn't survive. And then they said, well, Nazareth sounds close, and so we're going to say Nazareth. And that's what they did. I think that's what happened. I think that's how Mark came up with the Nazareth connection, because there's no evidence of a Nazareth connection before Mark. He seems to be the first person to ever mention that Jesus was from Nazareth. And we have certain clues that that was widely not considered the case, because in Acts refers to a scene where Christians themselves were called Nazorians. It says the Christians used to be called Nazorians. Well, that can't mean people from Nazareth, because the Christians didn't come from Nazareth, right? Like, it's not like these are all of Nazareth was converted and they went out as missionaries. No, the Christians, all the Christians were called Nazorians. So that means the question, well, what does that mean? That must have meant something else. And so that was actually one of the early names for Christianity, was Nazorians. And it meant something else. It didn't mean a town, which means that that tradition existed, probably before Mark invented the idea of it coming from a town. And so there's other evidence like that. So I don't think Jesus came from Nazareth. Even if he existed, I don't think he came from Nazareth. I think this is a scripturally created myth. And I think that's how they came. They sort of triangulated their way to Nazareth. I think that's how they came up with Nazareth as a town. Oh, your audio's gone again.
How plausible is it that the Gospels are 2nd century texts?
Very, actually. I would say that the mainstream consensus has moved a lot in this direction since I started. So like over the last 20 years, the idea of entertaining this has become more popular among mainstream scholars. And really kind of like the really right now, the mainstream consensus is 50-50 in the sense that generally scholars think Mark and Matthew are late 1st century, Luke and John are early 2nd century. Like that's kind of the most common opinion that you can find across mainstream scholarship. If you're not a fundamentalist, if you rule out fundamentalists, all you have left are the mainstream scholars, and those are the guys and gals who come to this conclusion. And that's my conclusion as well. I think there's good evidence for Luke, and that also entails good evidence for John, because John is clearly influenced by Luke. Now, John is problematic because our John has been multiply redacted, and this is another common opinion in the field that I think a lot of people don't know about, is that our John is the 3rd version of an earlier gospel, and we don't have the other 2 versions. So it started in one version, it got written over by another author maybe decades later, and then got written over again by another author decades after that. Maybe years, maybe not decades, but still. Multiple authors have redacted it. We only have the final version. We don't have the earlier ones. So when we're talking about John, we can really only talk about our version of it, but pieces of John might predate that. And so that's harder to talk about. It's like, when was 1st John, the first version of John, published? Well, we can't answer that because we can't reliably answer what was in that version of John. So that's the problem. And this is another example is issues of stylistic analysis, issues of redaction analysis, and things like that lead to our conclusion on this. And you can find that in any like mainstream thorough discussion now of the history of the Gospel of John. I name some authors, I give some examples in my treatment of John on the historicity of Jesus, if you're interested in that. But yes, so yeah, for sure. Now the question is could Mark be a 2nd century gospel? I'm less convinced by that. I think Mark is reacting to the Jewish war. I don't think it could be writing so much after it. Could Matthew be an early 2nd century gospel? Well, no, I think that's possible. But I don't think we can get Mark into the 2nd century. I don't think there are any good arguments for that. It could be pushed to maybe the 80s AD, but I don't think we can get Mark into the 2nd century. Good question from Hugh. Why does your audio keep dropping out, Garth?
Okay, in what way do you mean forgery? In what way?
Yeah, so a forgery, and I would recommend Forged by Bart Ehrman on this. Although, if you really want the academic skinny, his academic peer-reviewed version, which is Forgery and Counterforgery, is the best book to read on this. But his pop market book, Forged, is good at summarizing it. He defines forgery in there the way we all do in the field, and it's the correct way, which is it's a writing that claims to be written by someone that didn't write it. So generally you need to have a text. The text has to claim that it's written by someone, and that attribution has to be false. So that constitutes a forgery. So like Hebrews doesn't claim to be written by anyone, so it can't really be a forgery. It could be fake. Right? Like it could be a letter written long after the fact that it purports to be written in. But it wouldn't be a forgery because it doesn't have a name attached to it. Generally, you need a name attached to it, and that name has to be false. And that also has to be a name that the author put there. So like this is the other problem with the Gospels. The Gospels don't appear to have originally had any names attached to them. Those names were attached later. So you can't say that they were forgeries, even if they're complete fakes. Because the authors themselves don't claim to be Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. That seems to be someone else started claiming that about them and started stamping that label on them. And that's someone else's problem, their fault for doing that. It's not the author's fault. The authors themselves never represent themselves as being eyewitnesses. So that's very clear. Even John, the authors of John, and I say plural, as I just mentioned, authors of John don't claim to be witnesses either. They claim to have used some written source by this other guy that they call the beloved disciple, which is probably also made up, but they don't even name him. So it's not a name, and they don't claim to be him. So like, we don't have this lost gospel of Lazarus or whatever it might have been. We don't have that. So it's probably just fiction or myth rather than forgery. I hope that answered the question.
What does Dr. Carrier think of the new Thomas early Jesus saying papyrus?
I'm not sure what that's referring to, so it would help to have more
there
detail.
was a new papyrus that came out recently. I don't
really
think
recently, like Gospel of Thomas. Let me check that. Like, how recently are we talking here?
Like around the last two to 3 weeks, I think.
Oh no, I'm not aware of this. I did not see that. Can anybody send me a link? Throw it into the chat.
I did see it somewhere on
it's
Facebook.
Not popping up. So
I'll get it to you.
Yeah. I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it. But I'm interested to know, because this is interesting. Usually these are disappointing because, like, they say new manuscript and it turns out to be like 8th century or something. Like, oh, come on. So that's why I need to know, like, what is the actual claim. Like, that matters. And also whether it's Coptic or Greek. It's another big issue. But I don't know the answer to that, so I'd have to see. But yeah, if anybody finds it, send it to me. I might not see it in comments here, so you can email me at richardcarrier@icloud.com. That's my public email address. So just my full name, no punctuation, at icloud.com. Email me the link. It's fine if I get a zillion links with the same thing in it. That's fine. But yeah, get me informed on that.
Let me get. According to, I think, Josephus, what was the outlook on Jews or Israelites by other Jews or Israelites speaking the Greek language?
Now, let's see. I don't think Josephus discusses this, but the Talmud does. And the Talmud is a problematic source because it's late. A lot of its content might be early, but that's a difficult question to figure out. What the Talmud says, roughly, is that conservative Jews, now it's not all Jews, conservative Jews say that Greek education is verboten unless you're undertaking it to use it to do diplomacy with Greeks. And that's the way they phrase it. Now, we know in reality, most Jews and Jewish scholars studied Greek and were not punished for it. So it seems like only a very narrow, very conservative segment of Jews were anti-Greek education. Most Jews clearly were fine with it and didn't see a problem with it. And we see this even at Qumran. They were consulting Greek texts, so they didn't have a problem with that. So they clearly knew Greek. They clearly had a Greek education. And those were some, like, very hardcore Jewish thinkers. All right, I saw someone pop in. What have we got?
Yeah, I got my brother Trilla in the building. Trilla is a friend of mine, good dear friend of mine. We were supposed to do a debate on the Matthew 2, Luke 2, so he came in the right time. So we got a good amount of time, probably a good 30-40 minutes where we could chop it up. And hey, Trilla, how you doing? Let me hear your voice. Make sure you sound good on the microphone, brother. How you doing?
Good evening, gentlemen. How y'all doing? Dr. Carrier, Brother Garfield, what's going on?
Perfect. Sound perfect. You sound perfect, man. I hear that Texas accent kicking in. All right.
Gotta put on my Brooklyn Magic this evening.
All right. That's right. All right. So I don't. Do you want to share your screen, Trilla, or you want to just talk a little bit and then you share whatever you want to share? You want to do it that way?
We'll see if that's necessary. First thing I heard you guys talking, I seen the question pop up about the Nazarite, or about Christ coming from Nazareth. I want to see if I can reconcile that first. I know in Luke chapter 4, it says that he went to Nazareth, and after they tried to throw him off the cliff, he clearly came out of Nazareth right there. And when we look in Luke chapter 2, we see when we first see Joseph and Mary, I think that's Luke chapter 2, verse 1-5. They come from a town of Galilee called Nazareth. But the reason why Christ is called the Nazarite, you have to go back and look at the Old Testament with the Hebrew. The root word natsir, it's Hebrew H5342, and it means a shoot or a branch. And that Christ is one of the monikers. He's called the
and this is an actual theory that is advanced in the scholarship. So there are advocates of this, and it is a legitimate position. There are other proposals as well. So I've not been totally persuaded of one or the other, but I take this as a legitimate possibility for sure.
Yes, sir. And it's kind of a double entendre, if I could say, because when you look at the word natsir, one meaning of the word, the H5342, it means a sprout or a shoot. And we know that he's called the root of David. He's also called the branch. And another connotation of the word H5341, which is the same word, natsir, the same root word, is talking about a protective covering or a watcher. So, Christ is the offspring of David. He is that root, and he's also the protector and redeemer of Israel. So when you look at it in that sense, when you understand the Hebrew connotation, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I've totally seen that. Like I said, there's several scholars who've argued that too. So that's a distinct possibility. I agree.
Yes, sir. So, okay, so now what the brother Garfield wanted me to come up here for. So I also heard you saying that it was impossible that Herod could have died in 1 BC.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, extremely improbable. That's what we mean by impossible. But yeah, it's not logically impossible. But yeah, there's no evidence to conclude that he died so late. And all the evidence points to him dying in 4 BC.
Well, I would have to disagree. I seen evidence in scholarship that he could have died in 4 BC, but I also seen some scholarship where he could have died in 1 BC based off of a couple of solar eclipse, lunar, I think it was lunar eclipses or solar eclipses, that one of them was in 4 BC, and we also have one in 1 BC, and they have theories that tie his death to either one. So I believe that it could be plausible, but I'd be down to have that discussion.
Yeah, the lunar. Yeah, I've seen it's a lunar eclipse. I'm pretty sure it's lunar eclipse.
Hold on, Dr. Carrier. 1 second.
Yeah. All right.
Is that your biggest point of him dying at 1 BC because of the solar eclipse? Is that your main concept or main piece of evidence, Trilla?
No, I would, when it comes to this argument, when we were, doing our preliminary discussions and, getting ready for the debate, I went through so much research that I came up with a couple of different theories. Like we could have the discussion about Christ being born between 6 and 4 BC with Herod's death date at 4 BC. And we could also have the discussion with Christ being born between 3 and 1 BC with Herod's death at 1 BC. I compiled enough resources to have both of those discussions. So I wouldn't say that I had one, just.
All right, I get what you're saying, but this is what I was trying to ask you. The 1 BC argument, is your argument for 1 BC based solely on the solar eclipse? That's what I'm talking about.
Lunar
eclipse.
No.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah, no, it's fair.
Go ahead, Dr. Carrier. What's your response to that? And then I'm going to say something.
Yeah, I'll read. So this is Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, page 224. I have a whole section on this, on redating the death of Herod. So Josephus also mentions a lunar eclipse soon before Herod's death. And astronomers note that there was such an eclipse in 5 BC and 1 BC. So Inerrantists therefore want Herod to have died in or shortly before or shortly after 1 BC. However, not only is all the other evidence against such a notion, but the Jewish scroll of fasting records the calendar day of Herod's death, and it preceded that of the eclipse of 1 BC, but not that of 5 BC. Since Josephus says his death followed, not preceded an eclipse, the eclipse Josephus mentions was probably that of the year 5, and in the end, there is simply no evidence Herod died later than year 4, and no plausible case to be made that he did. This idea of dating deaths by eclipses is a common thing that happens throughout ancient writing, and there's a lot of fudging of dates to make these line up. So when Josephus says that it happened after a lunar eclipse, we can't say that it happened so soon after. It probably didn't, and then it gets compressed, sort of in legend, it gets compressed, the amount of time in between the eclipse and the death. So we're talking probably just a matter of months, since it's from 5 BC to 1 BC, or 5 BC to 4 BC. We're talking about a matter of months of difference. It's very easy for the legend to become that Josephus reports that it happened before the death. But it's very unlikely it happened exactly before. The idea of the deaths of kings being aligned with eclipses is very common. So the history gets fudged to sort of make that happen.
All right, let me add on to that. I think you just mentioned something that was very important. Now, there's 2 situations, I think, where they said he could have died 1 BC based off of the lunar eclipse, right? And you just brought up something, a primary source, which Israelites were writing, or Jews, called the Megillat Ta'anit.
That's right.
And what it is, Trilla, is that they documented like specific fasting days because they hated Herod. So they documented exactly the day when he died. So what happened is they're saying he died Sevna Kislev. Sevna Kislev would be between November 10th and December 10th. So if the eclipse took place in December or January, he couldn't have died after. So that actually counters the whole argument, because the Jews themselves are documenting because they hated Herod so badly. They hated him. So the whole eclipse thing that he died before is out the window because the Jews and the Israelites documented that. Another, you know what? I'm gonna leave it there. So I'm gonna say with the eclipse stuff, that's why I asked you if that's the only evidence you have regarding the eclipse, or if you have another argument.
It matters,
because the Sevna Kislev actually kills that argument. But go ahead, Trilla. The floor is yours.
Okay, so you say the 7th of Kislev. So, when I was doing my research on this, this is during the close of the 1st century BCE. And when you look at, how people calculate, okay, what's the difference between 1 BC and 1 AD?
Right.
You possibly lose 3 years. And the dating system that they used to use before we come up with the, before the Common Era, or the Common Era dating system that we use now, it was something different. Like, remember when we looked in the lexicon about Quirinius and Saturninus and Verus, it was like the dating system was like AUG 705 or something like that.
AUC, right.
Yeah,
I got you.
Those different dating systems, when they converted to the different calendar that we use now, from my understanding, a couple of years kind of got lost in translation. You guys, familiar with that notion?
Well, there's no evidence of years being lost. It could be off by months depending on which calendar you're using, but not years. It's possible for a historian back then to make an error of a few years, but it depends on what sources they're using. But that's why we look at the convergence of evidence to calculate what's a plausible answer. So we don't really trust a single piece of evidence. We look at how all the evidence converges on a conclusion, and that's how we come to that conclusion. It's very improbable that all the evidence would point to the same answer and that answer be wrong. It's not impossible. It's just less probable, and that's how we come to these conclusions.
I think Trilla does make a good point as far as the 1 BC to 1 AD. I don't know about 3 years. It's kind of confusing. What I do though.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, you're right. Yeah, it's because there's no year 0, so we're really talking about 1 year shift. But yeah, trying to get a 3-year error just from calendar conversion, that can't happen. There are no calendars that are that much out of alignment, even in antiquity. And there were a lot of calendars, but all the calendars were out of alignment by months, so you can definitely get an error of months.
What I will add is that I do know that most of this conversation outside of the Quirinius and the whole 6 AD, I don't think there's really our Centennius, not the one in the 7 BC, but the one in 5 AD. I don't think we really need to touch the AD era, because you have documentation from people who actually knew Herod personally. I'm going to talk about that in a few. But you have who the sources that Josephus uses. He's saying who he's using, and those particular people are telling us when Herod died. So this is why I'm saying to myself, who do I trust? Do I trust Josephus and this eclipse argument, or do I trust the primary source that Josephus is claiming at one point that he's using? But
yeah.
But
right, and there's also the coins evidence, and like we have actual archaeology supporting all of this as well.
So. Yeah, go ahead, Trilla. It's your turn. Go ahead, my brother. Trilla, you up, brother?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I think we would all definitely agree with everything that we look at, from the census, held by Quirinius in 6 AD. Yeah, I agree that, we wouldn't have to really bring that up, because I got all of the I got all the sources from Josephus. I think the main one we were talking about was book 18, book 18, chapter 3. Yeah, so I wouldn't, I mean, we could get into it if you guys want to, but if we stay,
of course, let's get into that. That's important. That's very important. I think we need to get into that. I think
we definitely can. If you guys want to, we can.
Yeah, go ahead. We got time. Go ahead.
I mean, I wouldn't, if you guys want to, I would prefer to talk.
Why? All right. Let's do it this way. Let's make it simple for everybody then. A level playing field. Let's say why do you think that in Josephus 18, why you think that's relevant in the situation of talking about Jesus's birth or Herod's death or when Jesus was born or whatever? Why you think that is important?
Well, when we look at Josephus book 18, it's not talking anything about the death of Herod. That's when it starts talking about Quirinius and the census that was held in the time of what's the guy's name? Judas of Galilee.
Oh, you're talking about when he talks about that there was a uproar or a rebellion because that's what you're
I'm sorry.
Okay,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought you were
talking that's when it was a literal taxation. When that's when Judea was literally a province of Syria. The time where I'm questioning. In Luke chapter 2, that was before Judea became a province of Syria.
So you're saying Luke 2 is before it became a province?
Yes.
All right. So why would you draw that conclusion for Luke?
Well, it's clear. I don't think Judea became a province of Syria until 6 AD.
Okay.
My theory is that in Luke chapter 2, 1-5, which happened in, like I say, I go with the 6 BC to 4 BC date to stay away from the death of Herod thing, just to make the conversation a little more level, unless you guys want to get into it.
No, we're going to get into it. We're going to get into all the points. We got to address it. I want to put it on record so we could go back to this video and refer to it. So go ahead.
But we do need to narrow which arguments are remaining. So it sounds like there's multiple different arguments here about getting Herod to have died in 1 BC is different. Like it's a whole separate thing from getting Quirinius, the census under Quirinius, to somehow apply before 6 AD or 5 AD, actually. Like those are two separate things, and to try and make both of those line up is like now we're doing a lot too much work to sort of undo the actual facts of history and get them to work out a certain way. So you got to pick a lane and then work your way, like force rank the points and then start with one and then work on that and then
exactly, Doctor. So I'm picking the 6 BC to 4 BC lane.
Yeah. But the question is so the usual line for the 6 AD thing is Luke says Quirinius, this is the census under Quirinius, right? Now Luke could have been wrong, like he could have gotten that wrong. But the problem is like his story doesn't make any sense if they aren't moving because of the census. There's a lot of problems with that story, but so it kind of depends on the Quirinius thing. And Quirinius, like there's a whole set of evidence regarding when Quirinius would have had any influence on that region. That's separate from when Herod died, right? So like the question of when Herod died that requires a whole other body of evidence. It's unrelated to the Quirinius question. That's, and they're both like, we can argue them both. That's fine. It's just you should focus on one at a time, like which one you want to focus on first.
Right.
And then go to the next if you want, or stick with the one. But yeah, there's two projects here. And so that's the problem, is what I'm looking at.
Oh yeah, exactly. So this is my theory. When we look at Luke chapter 2, and I'll go ahead, for the entertainment and the edification of the people, we could go ahead and just read this. In Luke chapter 2, starting at verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass," and I'm reading the New King James translation. "And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to a city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child." Now, this is my theory. When we look at Luke chapter 1, we got a clear timeline going, because from my research, the brother John the Baptist was born in 6 BC. So if he's born in 6 BC, when we look at what happened between the angel and Zacharias in the previous chapter, he's met by the angel. He's told what was going to happen. He goes and he meets his wife, and she hides herself. They conceive, and she hides herself for 5 months. So we got a timeline here. She hides herself for 5 months. Now, in the 6th month, which is 1 month later, the angel visits Mary. So Mary receives the message, and she goes immediately, once the angel tells her that she's going to, become pregnant and give birth to the Messiah. She goes to Elizabeth's house in the 6th month. So Elizabeth is now 6 months pregnant. Mary stays with her for 3 months. 6 plus 3 is 9. It takes 9 months to have a child. As soon as Mary leaves Elizabeth and Zachariah, John the Baptist is born. That's 9 months in 6 BC. Now, at least 6 months later, we're going to see Mary in Luke chapter 2. She's going to have a child. So if it's 9 months to have a child, they're overlapped by 3 months. That's 6 BC. That's I think that's 15 months. So that's a year that goes by. So now it should be like 5 or 4 BC, because everything is approximation and we off by a couple of months. So if we look at Luke chapter 2 and say that Quirinius was the governor when this census actually happened, making it 6 AD, Mary would be pregnant for 10 years. And that would be the biggest contradiction in the Bible. So I don't think that.
Okay, so that's all based on the reference to Herod the king, right?
Well, this is in the days of Herod when you look at Luke chapter.
Yeah, but there was always a Herod. This is the thing. Is that Herod Archelaus was also a Herod, and he was the king in 5 AD. He was the king who was removed or died, and then basically he died, and then Rome said, "We're taking his kingdom," and that's how it got incorporated into Syria. And that was Herod Archelaus, also a Herod.
That's exactly what Josephus 18 is talking about.
Right. And so Luke doesn't say Herod the Great, or he doesn't specify which Herod he's talking about. He's vague in his use of terminology. So like that doesn't really anchor us into a date 10 years earlier. It's entirely consistent with a date of only a couple years earlier, or a year earlier, right? For the whole timeline you're talking about. Yeah, because it was Herod Archelaus and then Quirinius, and that's what happened. So basically what Luke is saying is that Herod Archelaus was the last king of Judea, and then suddenly the Romans took over, and that's exactly what happened after the death of Herod Archelaus, and they give the census, and so they had to move. I mean, there's other technical problems with the story that you can retcon. Is that there wouldn't have been any reason for someone in Galilee to be counted in a census in Judea, because Galilee still wasn't a part of Judea then. It wasn't a part of Syria. It was exempt from the census. The only, you'd have to come up with a story like Josephus owned property in Bethlehem, but if he owned property in Bethlehem, why are they staying at an inn and therefore have to sleep in a manger or whatever, in a barn? And anyway, there's a lot of problems with it. You can retcon those problems, but it doesn't affect the date. The date remains the same. There's unquestionably the Romans were first in Judea in 5 AD. It's the end of 5 AD, start of 6 AD. The coin evidence is clear on this. And we have the coin evidence also shows that Herod stopped being king in 4 BC. And then the other Herods that succeeded him became king after for the remaining 10 years. We have the coinage showing this gap of 10 years of other Herods, his sons, ruling. And so Josephus's account is corroborated by the archaeology. That's an example of it. It's also corroborated by other historians like Dio Cassius and others who were aware of the kind of public records that would be available for this sort of thing. Although Cassius is writing a lot later, this is the kind of detail that would be still available to be confirmed in records at that time.
So do you think Luke chapter 1 verse 5? Oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
No, go ahead.
Hold on, Trilla. Let me add something to the conversation.
Oh, okay.
So the bottom line
I do want to hear what he has to say.
Right.
But yeah.
So the bottom line. Hold on. Go ahead, Trilla. Trilla, go ahead.
So do you think Luke chapter 1 verse 5, when it says there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, you think that's talking about Archelaus and not Herod the Great?
Yeah, it has to be.
Oh,
I mean, you have to look at an author in a coherent sense. Like the only other possibility is that Luke has made his own chronological error, and that either the Quirinius reference is false or the Herod reference is false. It's entirely possible Luke just screwed up, and that he doesn't know that Herod wasn't alive in 5 AD. If you want it to be true, all true, there isn't any reason to go beyond that. It's being the Herod that everybody knew was the king at that time. So there's no evidence that Luke thought that Herod the Great was still alive in 5 AD.
Well, the problem,
and also 5 AD is way later than 1 BC. But anyway, so there's also that problem. That's a separate problem. That's why these are two different boxes.
Right. Luke chapter 1 is first off said in 6 BC, and if we just look at the Greek, when we see Herod, the lexicon literally tells you that it's talking about Herod the Great in Luke chapter 1 verse 5.
That's a Christian apologist writing that, right? So no, it just says Herod, and there were a lot of Herods. So we can't. He didn't say any specific Herod. Luke doesn't say any specific Herod, so we can't get that specific. So we can't even accuse Luke of being wrong chronologically, because he's, at most, we could say he's being loose with vocabulary in the sense that king is a slightly technically inaccurate term. There's a particular kind of king called a tetrarch, but we can't count, and not everybody used that exact terminology. Lots of people called tetrarchs kings. So that kind of terminological vagueness is common in Greek. So it's not determinative. We can't really tell from that.
Let me add this.
Yeah, I disagree with that.
So does it say Herod the Great, Trilla, in Luke 1?
Yeah, Luke chapter 1 verse 5. Just looking at the Greek, I mean, if we can't
says Herod the king, that's what it says. Yeah.
Well, no, I'm talking about the lexical data. It says that it's talking about Herod the Great, because we see Herod Archelaus mentioned in Luke chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but you're talking about a dictionary that was written by a Christian, a modern Christian, who wants that to be the case. But there's nothing in the text that tells you that that's the Herod being referred to there. It could have been any Herod. There's lots of Herods.
Yeah, I think you would probably have to show me a source that's saying that this lexicon is wrong.
Well, all I need to do is show you a source that there were lots of Herods. So you could 4
or 5 of them.
You could just, well, I mean, I'm not saying Wikipedia is authoritative, but you can get sources from Wikipedia and look up Herod Archelaus, and it will tell you that his name was Herod. And we have actual coins and stuff that show that. So that he was known as Herod. So Herod is too vague a term. So we can't really, if you're going to conclude it's a particular Herod, you're going beyond the text. You're making an inference that is not in the text itself.
What year do you think John the Baptist was born?
I don't know. I don't even know if this story is true. So as a historian, I can't even date the birth of John the Baptist by this story. I think the story is made up. So I don't think this is even, I don't even think this is useful for dating the birth of John the Baptist. I doubt Luke even knew when John the Baptist was born.
Timeline that uses the consensus that says that John the Baptist was born in 6 BC. It's not a Christian opinion, but the scholarly consensus. So yeah, I don't know about that, sir.
I don't know about that. I don't know if that's true, actually.
Well, I could post the source real quick.
Right, but I'm just saying, like, I'm sure you can find someone who says it. I'm not contesting that. I'm just saying I doubt the mainstream consensus is that's the case. That I find very unlikely.
Let's address the 6 BC argument, though, that even if Jesus was born between 6 and 4 BC, which, I mean, most people think he's born around 4 BC or 6 BC, between that time period anyway. But you're saying that the Quirinius governor statement could be made at that time because Quirinius was possibly governor of Syria at that time. Is that
right?
Your argument?
You'd have to move the government of Syria, or the governorship of Syria of Quirinius to a different date,
or legate, or whatever title he was wearing at the time. So what do you say to that, Trilla? What do you say?
Yeah, when we look at Luke chapter 2, it doesn't even really say, once again, when you look at it in the Greek, it doesn't even say that Quirinius is the governor at that time. That word governor is not a noun, it's a verb in Luke chapter 2, verse 2.
Yeah, but the verb wouldn't apply if he wasn't a governor, right? And because of his senatorial rank, there's only one possible position he could have held, right? So there is no other possible position he could be holding at that time. You wouldn't say Quirinius was governing Syria at that time unless he was the governor of Syria at that time. So
was Quirinius the governor of Syria in 12 BC?
Yeah, we have evidence of that. Multiple other authors confirm that. Oh, 12 BC? No.
Yeah.
No. In 6 AD, yes. And for about 3 years, 6 to 9. 3 years is a typical tenure. So 6 to 9 AD, we have evidence, multiple corroborating evidence that Quirinius was there from 6 to 9 AD. He was not the governor of Syria in 12. We have no evidence of that.
Was he a part of the Roman government in 12 BC?
Well, these guys were always part of the Roman government, right?
Yeah.
So you know what? Senators they get sent around doing all kinds of stuff. So they
hold on, Chilla. He was a consul and governor of Galatia and Paphlagonia around 12 BC. We know that already. We know he was a proconsul in 15 BC. We already know that. But the issue is, we know for a fact he wasn't governor of Syria, though. Yeah. And how we draw that conclusion is very clear because we have the actual primaries to say what he was and at what certain time period. We know when he was assigned to certain areas. So what I will say is, we know for 3 years, if he was a governor, he may have ruled over certain areas, being assigned by, of course, his good friend Augustus Caesar, or that gentleman who was in charge, the emperor at the time. We know between 5 BC and 3 BC what he was doing. He was in a war in Pisidia, in Antioch, Pisidia. We know at 1 BC he was a guide for Augustus Caesar's grandson before he died. So we know what chronology, what he is and what title he held. So what I'm trying to figure out is, at 6 BC, what was Quirinius doing? What do we have to say that he was a governor or a legate at the time? Because we know the titles have specific names. The legate is pretty much the governor. So we know what he was at that specific time. So what are you saying, Trilla? What was he at 6 BC or 4 BC?
Well, we know in 6 BC, the literal governor noun of Syria was Saturninus. You guys agree with that, right?
Yes. And when?
6 BC.
Saturninus. Actually,
Saturninus. Yes.
Saturninus.
Saturninus.
The early part of 6 BC. Yes.
Yeah, I call him Saturninus.
I can't remember the exact dates off the top of my head, so I'd
9
have to
BC to 6 BC.
List, but...
Yeah, 9 to 6 BC is Saturninus, and then after him is Varus from 6 BC to around 4 BC.
So right, no problem. If Saturninus was the governor of Syria, the literal governor of Syria between 9 BC and 6 BC, was Quirinius the governor with him, or can we agree that Saturninus was the governor in 6 BC?
We can agree that Saturninus, based on the records, that he was the governor.
All right.
So there's no such thing as a co-governor either. That's another
exactly right, and I agree with that. So neither one of us is going to be making that claim. So Saturninus was the governor, and they already knew that Varus was going to be the governor after him, right?
Okay.
I'd have to check lists. I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah,
I know we know them all. We know all we know all the governors
Verus
in every 3-year term from 12 BC on. I don't have a list in front of me right now, so I can't confirm what those.
Yeah, I agree with him. Verus was the governor at that time. Well, actually, when Herod died, Verus was the governor when Herod died.
So when Saturninus was the governor, they already knew that Verus was going to be the governor after him. Now, wasn't Quirinius under Verus? Wasn't he like a lieutenant or something like that?
No, there's no such thing. These guys are senators, so senators never attached each other. So it's kind of like I don't know how to describe it. The way the class system worked, you didn't have a senator working for a senator. You would have equestrians working for a senator. So that's why Pilate is of equestrian class. So like he's a lower class person, middle class, like he's above nobody's. But so in Pilate's position, like governing a subsection of a province, it would be a grave insult, in fact, legally impossible to have a senator do that. You would have someone of lower class. So you'd have an equestrian do that, which is the case. And the equestrians all serviced the governor, and the only senatorial rank person between them and the emperor was the governor. So it was emperor, governor, and then all equestrians. The Romans never had a system where you had multiple stage senators in charge of each other. That did not happen. Senators they always were given their own commands and had their own responsibilities. They were never subordinated to each other. They would be subordinated to the emperor only.
Hey, let me ask Trilla this. Are you familiar who was the governor before Quirinius in Judea?
Oh, I've got it. I've got the list. I found it. Okay.
Yeah, who was the governor before Quirinius in 6 AD? Who was the governor before Quirinius?
In 6 AD, I have no idea. I kind of was trying to streamline my argument between 6 BC and 4 BC. I thought that's what we said we was doing.
I know. The reason why I brought it up, because the guy's name is the same name as the guy in 6 BC, Saturninus. So it makes a lot of sense that Tertullian, it's possible he could have made an error, but Tertullian is a problem because Tertullian also says in Against the Jews, the treatise, that 28 years after Cleopatra died, that's when Jesus was born. That's a problem because the 28 years would have been 2 BC. So he's saying that he's born in Saturninus, he's born during when Saturninus was governor. Saturninus' governorship ends at 6 BC. So he can't be born at 6 BC and 2 BC coming from the same author. So Tertullian can't be reliable because he's making a grave, big mistake. Now, as far as Quirinius under 6 BC now, we don't have any records that Quirinius at that point. If you have a primary right now, bring it out between 6 BC and 3 BC. We know what Quirinius is doing between 5 and 3 because we know he's in a war. He's in a war in Pisidia in Antioch. That's where he's at, and he's fighting the war. So we know exactly where he is.
Fighting the battle against the Mohammedances, right?
There you go.
And there you go. In the area, in the Syrian territory, right?
Watch this. This is the grave error that you just made. The Syrian area, there's 2 different Antiochs. As a matter of fact, there's 4. I'm sorry, Dr. Carrier. There's 4. The Antioch they're talking about is the one in Turkey, near Galatia. Yeah. That's not the one in Syria. So he wasn't governor in Syria. He was governor in Galatia. Hold on, let me put this on the screen so you could see this for yourself.
Oh yeah.
Galatia, Antioch of Pisidia. Hold on, I'm gonna put it on the screen right now for you, big bro. Antioch, Pisidia. So when you're reading it, it sounds like he's in Syria. He's not in Syria. Hold on, let me share the screen so everybody at home could see this for themselves. So I'm not BSing anybody. So when everybody think he's in Antioch, because this is a Christian argument that you're having.
Yeah, so that's true.
This is a big time Christian argument. I'm used to this. So this, if you look on the screen, it says Antioch of Pisidia, and look what it says. Alternatively, Antioch in Pisidia or Pisidian Antioch, and in the Roman Empire, Latin Antiquia Caesarea, was a city in Turkish Lakes region, which was the crossroads for Mediterranean, Aegean, and Central Anatolian regions, and formerly on the border of Pisidia and Phrygia. So in the geography, you see it's near Lake Eger. You see the map? Look at the map right here.
Yeah,
it's
which
all the way in Galatia, right up here.
Right. I was going to say, it happens to be in Galatia, which is the same Galatia Paul wrote his letter to.
There you go. So that Syria that you're saying in the Hamadandis, it sounds like a dagger, but it's really a dagger in reverse because it's talking about Turkey Antioch, not the same Antioch in Syria.
And what was that you had? I didn't see what you had up there in the
right here.
Let me see that.
It's Antioch in Pisidia, right here. See, they're telling you where it's located. Antioch in Phrygia.
You can see on the bottom right. Yeah, there you go.
It's shown within Turkey.
But does this article mention Quirinius fighting against the Muhammad?
No. I'm bringing this up to show you that Antioch of Pisidia is in Galatia. It's not in Syria. It's different Antiochs. They have 4 different Antiochs. So this specific Antioch of Pisidia is in Turkey. It wasn't in Syria.
Yeah, that's where the stones are that actually attest to Quirinius holding a position there.
Okay, so I'm still, y'all moving. I'm still on the same point when we was talking earlier about Saturninus and Varus and what's going on with these positions. So the first thing I want to do is I want to read this verse because you was saying that Herod Archelaus was the king of Judea in 6 BC, but I'm gonna read Matthew chapter 2 verse 22, which is a parallel with Luke. It says, but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. And all we got to do is look at the Greek, and it's going to tell you that this Herod
there's no doubt. There's no doubt that Matthew clearly wants the birth of Jesus to be between 4 and 6 BC. That's no doubt, and he's doing that. So that's why he's choosing to use the name Archelaus to distinguish the two, because he needs to distinguish the two Herods. They're both named Herod, but he's choosing to distinguish them because he's got his own narrative. Luke has abandoned this narrative. There's no he doesn't mention the name Archelaus. He just uses the name Herod. So we don't know. You can't argue that Luke is not meaning Archelaus because Luke is a different author. He's making his own choices as to how to refer to this king, and he could refer to him as Herod. He could refer to him as Archelaus. We can't tell. So that's why you can't argue that he means Herod the Great as opposed to Herod Archelaus. He just says Herod the King, and there was a Herod the King alive running things in 5 AD. So the fact that Matthew says something different, yeah, we totally agree. Matthew's trying to sell a completely different narrative, and Luke is trying to sell a completely different narrative. There's lots of facts in their narratives that are different. Like Luke has everything different than Matthew. So someone's lying. Someone's not telling the truth for sure, if not both of them. But when we're looking at Luke as a contained unit, as his own author, he does not say that he means Herod the Great. And that means he could just as easily mean Herod Archelaus. And so if we're to make Luke not make an error and be consistent internally, he must mean Herod Archelaus. Like I said, you can try to argue that Luke made a mistake, that he thought he was talking about Herod the Great and confused which Herod he was talking about. That's possible. I don't have any evidence that that's happened, but it's possible. But that wouldn't get us to any reconciliation because we're still stuck with Quirinius only being the governor over Judea and only therefore able to conduct a Roman census over Judea in 6 AD. And there's no way around that.
I think that's the problem, because with Quirinius now, when you talk about Quirinius 5 to 3 BC in Pisidia, we know he was there. We know he was with Augustus Caesar's grandson. We know we have the documentation, but the documentation, what's more important is the source that Josephus used, which is a primary Herod's buddy and Augustus Caesar's buddy, was documenting. He was the one that actually told Herod, as a matter of fact, Herod told that he wanted Archelaus when he changes his will or whatever, his verbal will or whatever he had. And he was the one that was defending Archelaus when they went to Rome because they didn't want Archelaus to rule. And that at that particular time period, that's how we know Archelaus was ruling from 4 BC, because Varus had to squash whatever uprising was at 4 BC, which is not Judas of Galilee, was the other guy. What's his name? Was it Judas of Galilee? At 4 BC, I don't remember who it was, but that was
we also have coin evidence confirming all this, and other historians. It's not just Josephus. That's true. The ultimate thing is that you have to give up something. Like you have to admit that someone made a mistake somewhere, either Matthew or Luke. Someone made a mistake somewhere. You can pick your mistake, But the only way to get them to be talking about the same thing is if you allow that, and probably more than one mistake, because the stories don't align at all. Like the excuse for changing from town to town is so radically different from Matthew to Luke, even regardless of the date.
Really?
Getting the two stories to fit is extremely difficult. It's possible, you can do it. You can come up with a retcon that would fit, but it's problematic. And so you have to admit something. Some mistake has been made. So either the census is not the reason that they went, and therefore Quirinius is a mistake. Luke mined Josephus, saw Quirinius had a census, and used the census as a fake story. Or there has to be some other reason that they changed towns. And because Matthew has no knowledge of a census. Matthew has no knowledge of this. So maybe there wasn't. And of course, we're already operating the assumption that any of this is based on any real things that actually happened. And very few scholars think that any of this is history. But if there's some sort of history here that we can actually get at, and that they actually had access to, someone made a mistake. Either Luke erroneously put Quirinius in a line and he shouldn't have, and he erroneously thought the census had something to do with the move. And that's possible. But you have to admit someone made a mistake. Either Matthew screwed up in not knowing about the census, or Luke screwed up in thinking the census had anything to do with it. Someone screwed up. And that's the only way to get them to be in alignment. Which I think exposes like why people care about this, right? Like if you can't accept that they made a mistake, there's something else going on here in this conversation that I think needs to be addressed. It's like why are they supposed to be inerrant? Why are they supposed to be incapable of making a mistake? The evidence is very clear. Someone made a mistake, either Matthew or Luke. If it's important for them to be talking about the same story, the same birth date of Jesus, the only way to do that is to admit that one of them screwed up, and then to pick a lane, pick which one of them is screwed up, and then build your theory around that. And that's how historians normally would approach this. I think most historians have given up on this. I think they don't think that either Matthew or Luke knew the truth. But
we got a few more. We got like 5 to 6 more minutes left. But before they go, let's talk about this, because one of the arguments is Augustus Caesar was given the title of Pater Patri, or whatever it's called, father of the country. And some people are saying that this was a worldwide census at that time at 3 BC or 2 BC, whenever it was. And they did this, and that's when the census was taken in Judea, and they took an oath. And this is also mentioned in Josephus at the same time. Let's build on that. Do you want to build on that, Trilla? You want to start that, Bill, or you want to go back to 6 to 4 BC?
Yeah, because when the conversation first started, I heard that it was said that we were going to stay away from the 6 AD, but for some reason we keep going back there.
That is the problem, right? Is that Luke says basically something that sets it in 6, and if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for Quirinius, like if Luke had never used the word Quirinius and never mentioned census, there wouldn't be a problem. So the 6 AD date is unavoidable, is the problem.
Well, it wasn't my idea to stay away from it. I think you're the one that said we had to be laser focused. And
I get you, right? Yeah, like pick a lane. But
my lane was 6 BC and 4 BC, because I got an argument for 6 BC to 4 BC. I got an argument for 3 BC to 1 BC, and we could talk about 6 AD. So since we're going in chronological order, I'm starting between 6 BC and 4 BC.
That makes sense. That does require you, though, to somehow refute or re-explain Luke's positioning of the date. So that's why we do. You're right. We do get stuck having to argue both. But that's why the thing is we started with the death of Herod. That was the problem. The death of Herod is a different question from the date of Quirinius. Those are the two lanes. When you start arguing for the coherency of the narratives, then you have to pick the lane of 6 AD, because 1 BC death of Herod doesn't solve the 6 AD problem, right? So that's what happened. So I think we were supposed to be arguing about when did Herod die? What is the evidence for that? Completely separately from whether the Gospels are correct.
I'm just trying to finish the sentence. I'm trying to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to explain how we got off the rails there. But go ahead. Yeah.
So I was asking about Saturninus, Verus, and Quirinius. So the question that I was going to ask is before you become the governor of Syria, do you have to hold other positions, or can you just come out of nowhere and be the governor of Syria?
There is an answer to that question. Yeah. To be the governor, it's called a proconsulship. So in order to be a proconsul, you have to have been consul. And consul is kind of like, the best equivalent I could think of is like vice president. There are 2 consuls every year. You have the emperor. Sometimes the emperor was one of the consuls. And there'd be usually 2 but you have to be a senator. And usually you had to have held other ranks. So you had to have been a quaestor. You had to have been a praetor. So you go up the ranks. You're a quaestor for a bit. Then you become a praetor for a bit. Then you get to be a consul. And then once you're a consul, you're qualified to be a proconsul. And that's where most provinces were proconsular provinces. And so you would send someone who had been a consul and they become a proconsul, which means working on behalf of the consuls. So, which really meant the emperor. Now, some few provinces were governed by praetors and propraetors, but they're nowhere near where we're talking about. So that's not relevant. But those are still senators. They're just lower ranking senators. So to be a proconsul, you had to have been a consul. But consul is a empire-wide position. It's not a provincial position. And then you become a governor. And usually what happens is these guys get moved around. So there's no example of any governor ever governing the same province twice. And there's a good political reason for this, we suspect. Yeah, we think that the emperor never wanted that to happen. So these guys get moved around. So once you're a proconsul, they have you govern various provinces. Occasionally, they'll give you a special military commission where you go invade somebody like Germany or something like that. But mostly you're moving around until you retire. And that would be normally they tell you to retire or you decide to retire. And then you just go live on your fancy villa in Italy or Spain or wherever. But yeah, so that's the backstory for how you become a proconsul, aka a governor of a province.
So did Quirinius have to move through those ranks?
Yes, he only achieved the consulate in, I think, 12 BC. So he could never have governed a province before 12 BC. He could have started governing provinces in 12.
Yeah, he was actually a proconsul. He was a governor, but he was a proconsul, which is only 1 year. So he was allowed to do that in Crete and in Cyrenaica.
Those are governorships. Yeah, those are probably, certainly Crete would have been a governorship, for example. And yeah, it's not always 3 years. 3 years was the max usually. There's no law on this. It just, we see the pattern. Like we never saw, no governor ever governed more than 3 years. And they usually govern 3 years. And then they get moved to another province. That was the practice.
So could the Greek word hegemonio apply to a proconsul or a procurator, which I think Quirinius had to hold both of those?
So,
not as a procurator.
Actually, so technically, yes. That word can apply to both positions. The problem is that Quirinius cannot have held both positions. So a proconsul is different from a what was the other one you asked? You said
procurator.
Procurator cannot be a senator. This is a low position. Senators would never deign to take the position because it was kind of like, I don't know, like a noble becoming someone's poop boy or something. Like it was a different class level. So only people of equestrian rank would take the procurator position. Really, it's prefect, but that's a whole other debate that's not relevant here. But prefect or procurator is the same. It's equestrian rank. No one of senatorial rank would ever take that position. So Quirinius, Quirinius has been a senator since before 12 BC. So he's way higher ranking than procurator or prefect. So the only positions he could have held after 12 would have been proconsul. That's literally the only position that was available to him because of his high rank.
So could the verb hegemonio apply to him as a proconsul?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it could apply, for example, to Pontius Pilate, who was of equestrian rank, not senatorial. It could apply to Pontius Pilate over Judea. Like he could be called a hegemon over Judea, right? So the word is flexible. The reason the word itself is not what tells us what position it is. It's the class level of the person being referred to that tells us what the position is, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So if Quirinius is actually a proconsul and he's not called the governor as a noun, the verb hegemon is applied to him in Luke chapter 2, don't that mean that he's not the governor, since we know that Saturninus was the governor at this time? Like when Saturninus was the governor of Syria, was Quirinius the proconsul?
Well, that would be a circular argument, right? So only one person could be the hegemon of Syria. So only one person could be doing that, and so the question is, who was doing that? Was it Quirinius? If the answer is yes, then it's 6 AD. If it was someone else, then Luke should have put another name there. And so you could say, like, maybe Luke screwed up. Maybe he meant to write Saturninus, or maybe he meant to write Varus, or maybe he meant to write someone else and he fucked up. That's possible, but you would have to concede that he messed up. There's no way Quirinius could have been governing anywhere else, because we know who was governing Judea or Syria all those other times, up from 12 BC all the way up to 6 AD. And there's no query. And we know they didn't hold multiple governorships. We know there's no co-governorship. We know, like, there's no sub-governorship. So there's just no way to make it work. It's just the probability is that if you want it to work, you just have to say that Luke screwed up. You put the wrong name in there.
Let me say this, Dr. Carrier, and to Chilla before we go. There are several things that Luke did. Luke said that Quirinius was the governor of Syria, right? If we want to say that's the word governor. But he also said when there was a census going on, or a taxation, so the counting of numbers,
and that lines up with Josephus,
and it also happened in Judea. So now, Trilla, you're gonna have to show us Quirinius performing a census or a counting in Judea while he's governor of Syria. You can't do that. There's no way you can do that.
It's the list of problems. We can't do them all.
Because Luke chapter 2 does not say that Quirinius held the census, and Luke chapter 2 does not say that Quirinius.
It said while he was governor, the census was being held.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing. It doesn't say that he's the governor. Like, put it this way. We got Trill Deacon on stage. We got Richard Carrier, and we got Brother Garfield. Now, wherever you are, Brother Garfield, you're governing your affairs. Dr. Carrier, wherever you are, you're governing your affairs. Wherever I am, I'm governing my affairs. Us three men on this call right now, we are all governing our affairs in our daily life. The verb hegemon could be applied to all three of us, and none of us are the governor of Syria. True or false?
Hey, Trilla. I'm gonna ask you one question.
Irrelevant, but true. Yeah.
That's just how easy it is.
Hold on, Dr. Carey. Hold on 1 second.
Stop laughing.
Hold on 1 second. 1 second. Can we agree that the word governor or governing in Syria is talking about Quirinius having some sort of power in Syria? Can we agree on that, Trilla?
Yeah, just like me governing my affairs mean.
All right. When did Quirinius do any form of rulership or governing in Syria? When did that happen?
Put it to you this way. I'm gonna pull a couple of Bible translations for you and show you this.
No. This is a simple question, Trilla. Before we go there,
this
is the key to the whole conversation.
Yeah, I think we're kind of, well, first of all, we're out of time. Secondly, clearly this is a whole debate unto itself that requires its own time. So we would have to do that sometime. And what I would suggest is that Trill, that you should read my chapter on this in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, and then maybe even like follow up some of the resources, like some of the footnotes and links and stuff like that, and then like get versed in all of this. And then we have a debate, because then maybe it could move the ball down the field, where you know all of these things about the coin evidence and all of that stuff.
Oh, I know about all of that.
Yeah, I just get the impression that you don't. But then you at least know how to frame.
I can pull it up right now on my laptop. I'm looking at it right now. I already got the slides up.
The coin evidence? You got the coin evidence up?
I got the coin evidence right here on my laptop.
Okay, so here's an example. Yeah, no, this is a whole another hour of debate, which we don't have. Which we should do. I think that's totally doable in future, but we're out of time tonight, so we just can't get into it, unfortunately.
Well, it was a pleasure and an honor talking to you, Doctor.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, it was nice.
Brother,
Before Chilla go though, answer that question. When was he governing Syria? Literally Syria.
we have them right here in Luke chapter 2 and 5 BC. So I'm gonna read these couple of translations. When you look at there's some old translations. I got the Bishop Bible of 1568, the Coverdale Bible of 1535, and the Tyndale Bible of 1526. Because what I'm seeing from the brother said Luke chapter 1 verse 5 is talking about Herod Archelaus. I don't know if my good brother Dr. Carey is familiar with the Greek language. So let's look at what this verse says.
Wow.
And this tax was first that was executed when Cyrenius was lieutenant in Syria. It doesn't say that he's the governor.
You're really relying on these really old Bible translations by Christian interpreters. That's your way of doing it. Okay.
Hey, that's just one.
Well, hold on, Trilla, hold on. But when was Quirinius lieutenant in Syria? That's the key, bro.
Well, let me answer you.
Go ahead.
Remember, Dr. Carrier said it himself. The verb hegemonio or hegemon has a wide range.
That is
true or false? It's true.
No, it's really true.
First of all,
that isn't the problem.
Not a noun. Saturninus is the governor noun of Syria.
We all agree. There's only one position.
Exactly.
There's only one position that Quirinius could be holding. There's only one. There's no.
Well, let me finish.
Other.
Let me finish. Saturninus is the governor of Syria at this time. We all agreed. And he's the governor noun. It's a title, it's a position, it's a noun. The verb could be applied to anybody who had authority in the Roman government at that time. It's a verb. It's just that simple.
No.
Quirinius was the procurator at this time, or a proconsul, and it's just that simple. Saturninus.
That's a violation of grammar.
Quirinius was after him.
Yeah,
that's what the whole misunderstanding is. It got a lot
of chill.
It would be like saying Kamala Harris ruling America. She's not ruling America. She's vice president, right? You would never say she's ruling America. And ruling is very vague in terms of a specific office, right? Like who rules, like you're talking about a king or you're talking about a president, whatever. But you would never say Kamala Harris was ruling America. It would be Biden. Like that would be like a kind of like hammy way to describe his position. He's ruling America, yada, yada. But that would be the only person that you could be referring to. If you're talking about who's ruling America, you could only mean Biden. You can't mean Kamala Harris. And so you wouldn't mean someone even further down the list, like, Kevin McCarthy or anything like that. No, that isn't what you would say. And Luke would never say that. So you would never say ruling and mean someone other than the person who was actually ruling.
Yeah, Trilla. So you're saying that you have a source that says, I'm not talking a biblical source. You have a source that Quirinius was lieutenant or some sort of
He's
position.
talking about it's an old translation. It's an
old
English translation.
I figured that out. You could go on Bible Hub and see that. Everybody could see
you just go right on Bible.
Totally.
But I'm trying to figure out, Trilla.
It doesn't say he's the governor though.
Trilla. All I'm asking you is, where do you find that source at 6 BC or 4 BC of him governing in Syria? Or doing anything, being a lieutenant, doing anything, any form of position literally in Syria.
Yeah, I got a couple of sources that say that.
No, I'm not worried about sources that say that. Anybody could write and say that today. I'm talking about a primary source.
I don't really deal in modern scholarship. I like to go ancient as far back as I can. You know that, Brother Garfield.
But this is what I'm saying though. If Quirinius has a title at that time period, you're going to be the first person to produce that in history because there's no records of that. You're producing something in Syria. So you know what? Let me give you 2 minutes. Go ahead. Present your source. Let's go.
Let me see. The first thing I got is matter of fact, I'm not going to say that one. Let's go with something easy. I got Justin Martyr right here. The First Apology, chapter 34. It says, now there is a village in the land of the Jews, 35 stadia from Jerusalem, in which Jesus Christ was born, as you can ascertain also from the registers of the taxing made under Cyrenius, your first procurator in Judea. Justin Martyr don't even call him, and that's 160 BC. Justin Martyr's not saying that he's the governor of Syria. He says he's a procurator.
Yeah, actually though, look at it this way. Justin Martyr also says in the First Apology that 150 years before he was writing this, that's when Quirinius or when Jesus was born, which goes back to 6 AD. He says that in his own writing. He also says, as you said,
say that again.
Justin Martyr says, I'm going to give you the quote from First Apology. He says, while First Apology, he said 150 years ago, and it was written, First Apology was written between 155 and 157 AD. He said 150 years ago was when Jesus was born. That's what he said in his own writings. So he's going back to 6 AD. So when you're saying he's the procurator of Judea, he possibly could have been talking about the same time period when Jesus was born. So when you use, and by the way, to using the church father, don't make it actual history. This is just what's going on in his mind based off of him reading the Bible and is part of his belief. So you don't necessarily, just like what I said with Tertullian. Tertullian said this happened when Saturninus was governor, 6 BC. And he also says 28 years after Cleopatra died, which is 2 BC. So when did Jesus born for Tertullian? 6 BC or 2 BC? So you can't take the church father and say that's a source saying exactly what happened, because these guys are just believers who are repeating a tradition, what they know from the history of the Bible.
Hey, that's what I am.
In addition to that, Justin's writing in Greek, and procurator is a Latin word. So what we could do is if we had the time, we don't, but if we had the time, I could bring up the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, the actual Greek passage of Justin Martyr, triangulate, figure out what passage you're referring to, and bring it up and look at the actual Greek, because translations into English are always interpretations. So there's no guarantee that he actually said procurator. He might have said something else, and someone just translated it as procurator. Now we know for a fact that that has to be false. That he cannot have been a procurator. Procurator was not a senatorial rank; it was a sub-senatorial rank. So Quirinius was never a procurator, not ever in his entire life. Like even as a baby, he could not have even. He was too high ranking. Even as an infant, like the first day of his birth, he was too high ranking to have ever been a procurator. So we know that would be false. But I would also, you could look at the Greek, and I'm sure the word procurator is probably not there. It's been a while since I've looked at that passage in Justin. But anyway, like I said, that this takes time, and there's so many like angles to this that
there's a lot of sources here. But I'm gonna say this though.
So when we do round two,
I'm gonna bring back Dr. Carrier.
This is fun, man. Nice to meet you, Doctor. Man, it's fun, man.
Hey,
it's good. I like the joviality, and I like your approach. So it's good.
All right, peace and love, family. Thank you again, Dr. Carrier, for coming on, taking the time out. Trilla, I love you, bro. You're doing your thing.
Thank you, brother Garfield. I appreciate the opportunity, brother.
It's my man, Trilla. Hold on, Trilla. We got to put your YouTube page. What's your YouTube page again? The Grand Hedron?
Oh yeah, man. It's the Grand Hedron, man. You know what I mean?
Let me type it in the chat. Hold on. How you spell it? GRANDHEDRIN, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. I'm gonna put it on the screen, family. Just go to YouTube and look this up right now and subscribe to my brother. And just put a note in the chat that brother Garfield sent me here, man. And we good. That's my brother right here. He's doing some good stuff. He's doing some good studying. We build all the time on Clubhouse and fan base. He's a good brother. Hey, trying to get Dr. Carrier. I'm trying to get Dr. Carrier to come on Clubhouse, man. He said it ain't popping enough.
Oh, hey, man. It's the ugly corner over there, Doctor. I don't know, man. You don't look like you're ready to come out there, man. I'm a lot on Clubhouse, man. Hey, Garfield, the book that he's talking about.
I got it. I need
that. I'll start reading that book right now.
I got you. All right. Hey, peace and love, family. We out of here. Dr. Carrier, I'll hit you up tomorrow. We take care of everything then.
Yeah.
And peace and love to you. Thanks for taking out the time, man. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Wait to see you again, Doctor.
Absolutely.
All right. Peace and love, family. We out, man. Peace and love. Subscribe to Grand Hedron.